Hello, my name is No Sweat. I am the person who raises racing pigeons in eastern Kentucky, in Richmond, Kentucky. It's a college town where Eastern Kentucky University exists, where I went to school and swam on the swim team there under Don Combs. I'm calling this the dark side of No Sweat because there's not going to be any imagery. It's all going to be in the dark. I wanted to keep it that way because the stories that I enjoyed the most growing up were the bedtime stories that my grandmother told me. When I'd lay beside her, she would tell me Bible stories. And I always enjoyed that, being in the dark, laying in the bed with her and listening to her tell me different stories. My mind would imagine scenes much better than if I was awake or there was light on. And I've done a lot of spelunking in my lifetime, done a lot of caving, and it seems like when everybody's in a dark room together, like you are in a cave, you can't get any blacker than that people pay more attention to what's being said. I've been with all types of characters in caves, and it seems like once everybody's in a cave, everybody's equal. And I'm hoping that this is a new way of telling stories about pigeons. I think it's more important to listen to what a person's saying than to a lot of times be looking at everything around him. And so again, I'm experimenting with this darkness. I want to tell two main stories, and the first one's going to be about Charles Heitzman. And Charles Heitzman was my mentor and possibly the most famous racing pigeon man that ever lived in the United States. He lived about 100 miles from me, more like about 75 miles actually, and I grew up as a teenager visiting his house about every week or several times a month, and then at times that I would stay with Charles for long periods of time. And as he grew older, and before he died, I was staying at his house lots of times, several days at a time. I was asked by an attorney, Sions, who is the editor of the Racing Pigeon Digest, now the leading racing pigeon magazine in North America, to do an article about Charles Heitzman. And that's the story I want to tell you all today, and then I will tell you another story after that. When Gene Yos, the attorney and editor, asked me to do this story, I was a little bit stumped because Charles Heitzman was a very complex person when it came to racing pigeons. And I will try to start from the beginning and go in I will jump back and forth in telling this story about him. From my past experiences in writing novels, at the time it would, I knew that this, taking on a job, writing an article about him would be complicated, as it is in writing novels. And one of the books that I've written about, wrote, was called Singer Island and Ernest Hemingway. It's in 2 volumes. Hopefully I'll have a 3rd volume before I die. It was intended to have 3 volumes. But if you get that book, it's on the internet, Singer Island and Ernest Hemingway by No Sweat. It's easily found on the internet. You will see a great many photographs, original photographs that I took of Charles Heitzman that are in that book. It's one of the few books that I've written that really shows a lot of my racing pigeons early in my life, and my early pictures of my relationship with Charles Heitzman early in my life. In my lifetime, after having received over 600 handwritten letters from Charles Heitzman, and many monthly visits to him and weekend stays at his home, I knew the sort of article he deserved. To accomplish this, the story would have to go into a rather lengthy detail, as Mr. Heisman's complex and rich life in our sport was unlike anyone else's. I've never met anyone that was Mr. Pigeon more than him. I could repeat that a million times, that he was probably the best pigeon fancier that ever lived. He was not so much another master within our sport. He happened to be the master in our sport. He lived and breathed and smelled racing pigeons 24/7 every day of the year, whether near or far, or awake or asleep. Never before had there ever been such a fancier, so compassionate about every small facet within our sport. As similarly referred in the Bible, he knew when the sparrow fell, and in this case, when a pigeon. I should clearly state that Charles Heitzman was quite truly the genuine godfather of racing pigeons in America for many decades. Far more prominent and longer lasting than any other racing pigeon man in American history. Even those fanciers who thought they knew him had no actual idea of his total commitment and worldwide involvements with racing pigeons. In every way, he was the man who broke the ground for the way most of the current top racing pigeon flyers now breed and market their pigeons. Arrogant to some mild degree, yes, that's what he was. Humble, very certainly too, on that. He was a man of many colors, and all of them connecting the very origins of our sport to the future we have now. He surrounded himself with racing pigeons, and the library he created and maintained on racing pigeons became the finest and largest library of racing pigeons and pigeons period in the entire world. And I knew before I began to ever write an article about Charles Heitzman that I would in no way be able to encompass all that Charles Heitzman accomplished. For to do so would easily fill an interesting and historical book well beyond thousands of pages. And yes, I awaited the introduction of myself in this article so you might appreciate just why I am the best person who could write this story. The large photo of Charles Heitzman, now in the American Racing Pigeon Museum in Oklahoma, that person standing beside him, that happens to be me. I am one of the few remaining flyers to this day who still maintain a colony of his Sions, and probably the only flyer alive who actually takes these Sions out to 500 miles each year. During the last 35 years of his life, I wrote more articles on Charles Heitzman, which were published worldwide, than all the other pigeon scribes all put together. I am that person who wound up with many of the articles he kept in his famous library. I am the person who has retained his famous yearly AU-issued KY bands, and each year band my young birds in the memory of him. I even trained my racers from his original wicker baskets. Yes, there are long stories behind all of this. There were many pigeon fanciers who loved him, but I loved him more than any of them. And yes, I am quite biased when it comes to Charles Paul Heitzman. If you had shared the experiences that I had with him, you would have been too. I first met Mr. Heisman when he was a flyer's flyer and a breeder's breeder in 1959. It was hard to place a thumb down on any given year as that year being the finest, but certainly in 1959 he was at the top of his game, and there was not a racing pigeon flyer throughout all of North America and much of the world who did not know his name.
I was 8 years of age. My grandfather drove me up to his beautiful home to see him, and when they met, I so felt I had two grandfathers at that time alongside me. The two men hit off immediately. They were very much alike, laughing and sociable, and each very successful in business and whatever else they pursued. My grandfather bragged on me, talking about what a great grandson I was, and Charles Heitzman took that to heart. I have met many wonderful pigeon men in my life, the best racing pigeon in America, and the best showman in America. And of all of them, none have stood as tall as did Charles Heitzman. Not even close. By quirk of fate, as that 8-year-old child, my returning one of the lost racers to him after it had been caught in a storm on its race home, I grew up somewhat as his adopted pigeon grandson. It was simply unheard of for anyone to return a lost KY banded bird back to him, back to Mr. Heitzman. He laughed about it to me and spoke of it often. Everyone in the United States knew that the KY bands and who had them. And if it was a KY banded bird that happened to have flown into their lofts, it remained there quietly forever. No one ever returned them because they knew the quality of pigeon that they had been fortunate to have flown into their loft. As I grew older and began flying his Sions, writing pigeon stories and photographing his racers, it only endeared him more to me, for Charles Heitzman was himself a writer as well, having written 7 books concerning his pigeons, books I must add which were large successes and still are selling to this day. As much as he had admired my grandfather, he later admired my wife, Chestine, even more so. We had the very best of relationship, mutually respecting each other and being fellow Kentuckians and talking about all the wonderful things that exist in Kentucky, the bluegrass state, the great racehorses we have here, and so many things to be thankful for. As I grew older and began flying his Sions and writing pigeon stories and photographing his racers, I learned that the birds themselves carried his name on them more than it wasn't just a strain. He had a stamp on those birds that were special. It was hard to put into words, but it was something you could sense when you saw his pigeons. Mr. Heisman was called Colonel Heisman because he was actually a Kentucky colonel. And a Kentucky colonel is an honorary title which for many years has been given to citizens by the Kentucky governor. When I began going to college, I swam long distance on one of the very best swimming teams in the entire nation, facing teams with Olympians such as Mark Spitz and Frank Edgar and others. Heisman was strong and positive influence on my life and in my swimming. He was always one big smile when I would come to stay with him, as I would bring 2 cases of those small bottles of Miller Pony beer, which he would place in his refrigerator inside his famous pigeon library located out on the back lawn of his home and close to his fabulous array of pigeon lofts. A more picturesque setting for racing pigeons has never been equaled. When I received my master's degree in college, Heisman sent me a letter, and inside that letter was a $100 bill and a note stating that he had never graduated from college and how proud he was to have me as his dear friend. In his later years, I would sporadically be asked by Mr. Heisman to visit him and live with him at his home in the country in Jeffersontown, Kentucky, usually for a few days. And when his health began to falter and he had trouble finding help, at that time his wife, Agnes, had been dead for some time. We both missed her, and his daughter, Bernice, lived with him. It was a time-consuming and physical task to go around to some 41 different lofts and make sure his colony of some 1,000 racers, which he had at the height of his breeding season, were all amply fed and watered, and that every little matter pertaining to his pigeons was accurately recorded. Nobody in pigeon history had ever kept such lengthy and perfect pedigrees. Amen. And such gorgeous pedigrees they were, most usually written in his unique, distinct, and beautiful penmanship. They were well, almost paintings in themselves. In the 1980s, he could easily, generation after generation after generation, accurately trace any of his pigeons back for over 50 years. In his bedroom he reserved for me, which was in his home, he kept a record file on cards, everything perfectly neat and in alphabetical order, which would have amazed any fancier or a librarian. Many times I would lay in that bed, adjust the night lamp, and pull out one of the oak drawers which went to his files, and be dazzled by his attention to detail. So much time and work and effort. Fanciers did not realize this, but it was nothing short of an honor to own one of his pigeons, simply because of the meticulous recorded genetic studies which had gone into the creative makeup of that racer. Mr. Heitzman raised close to 500 young birds each year, sometimes less, sometimes more, and it was never enough to meet the sport's demand. Every November, he would place an ad in the American Racing Pigeon News, usually listing 45 to 75 different birds that he had for sale. Within 2 days, every bird would be gone. And yes, he kept an incredible and thorough record where each of his birds went. Many times, flyers would make outstanding long distances wins with his birds, and Mr. Heisman would later manage to wind up getting those birds back from them and have that bird back into his loft to use for breeding. His famous logo on all he did was simply, "From the best, come the best." I have enjoyed an incredible life for a poor, ignorant hillbilly coming from a poverty and alcoholic parents. My life has been such a strange dream. One day I'm living with John D. MacArthur and laughing about his pet ducks at the Colonnades Beach Hotel in Singer Island, and the next day I'm wheelchairing Rose Kennedy around in Palm Beach on her estate and listening to her stories, telling me about John and the other members of her family. I was with Jacques Picard when he lowered his Ben Franklin into the Gulf Stream, discovering the currents. That happened in the same day, the same week that we landed on the moon, and there was very little mention of it. I was with Arlo Guthrie, and I shared an apartment for 4 months one summer next to him. And sadly enough, I was with Will Lang's daughter when she committed suicide. Will Lang was a very famous war correspondent for Life magazine and a close friend of Ernest Hemingway's. It goes on and on. My writings, whether he is mentioned or not, are dedicated to my writing mentor, Guy Davenport. Guy Davenport, my next book, which appeared by the time of next year, was called Letters from a Genius to an Oaf. It involved my 15-year relationship with Guy Davenport. You can find Guy Davenport on the internet, Guy Davenport author. He was the author of 46 books. He was my literary mentor. He loved the stories that I wrote about pigeons. He told me not to be ashamed about writing about pigeons. He said that Robert Frost had written about chickens, and he loved my pigeon stories. So that meant a lot to me, and all the different people that I have known, famous or not, they eventually have come to know me through my pigeons. It's been a common denominator, or whatever you want to say. It's been an easy way for me to make friendship with strangers because everyone knows what a pigeon is. for me to have known Charles Heitzman the way that I did has to also rank up there in another strange dream moment in my lifetime with different people that I've known. I was very fortunate to know the very finest racing pigeon man that ever lived. He knew so many people in our sport, and through him I got to know about other people in the sport that were also men that he respected as great racing pigeon flyers. Elaine Miller, the list was endless. Heisman knew all of them, and they all knew him. He was on the tip of everyone's tongue in America for so many, many years when it came to racing pigeons. Why he took out the time he gave to me will always remain something of a mystery, not only because of our introduction when I was a child, but the way he treated me throughout my life as I grew from being a child into a teenager into a young man, and until I got into my 30s and stuff, and was the strong friendship that we maintained throughout the whole time. His trust that he kept in me, his faith he had in me, and our friendship, our strong friendship. I suppose perhaps it may have begun somewhat with his feelings, possibly having a little pity for me, and then later a true and tested friendship. Real friends are so rare in this world. I hope that this article will entertain and educate you, this story I'm telling you, and I hope that Colonel Charles Paul Heitzman somehow can look down for a brief moment and smile about this story I'm telling about him. He loved publicity. He had an ego, and at the same time, I said he was a very humble man, a very generous man, and a very sweet person. Very sensitive, had a great conscience. I don't know what else to say about him. I mean, no person is completely dead, I believe, so long as someone remembers them. And I remember Charles Heitzman every day I wake up. So he's never dead. How'd I start the beginning of Charles Heitzman? How'd I start to tell you this story about him? Should it be when his parents immigrated from Germany? And how he forever kept that big trunk that his parents used during that immigration? The trunk, the one which owned everything they had as they made their journey into America, forever tucked away under his main racing loft. Should I talk about that? Or should I begin with his family giving up the last letter in his last name, Heitzman? The Heitzmans were German, and they ended their name with two N's, Heitzmann. In order to be Americanized themselves, they dropped off one of the N's, and he became Heitzman, Heitzman. Or do I go back to when he first bought his home in the country and began to remodel it into a show place, and in the doing additionally created the finest array of varied racing pigeon lofts ever assembled under the sky? Two-story lofts, military lofts, show lofts that were oval in shape, and lofts that were picturesque that ran along the creek, and perfect racing lofts high off the ground. His mind was always racing with different kinds of lofts, concrete block lofts, repeating lofts. That he went on and on with all the different kinds of lofts that he had. But primarily, he had so many lofts because of at the end of World War II, he was able to get a lot of the military lofts through his son, which had been in the Signal Corps. Had been very prominent in the Signal Corps with racing pigeons. So Heitzman had many of those military lofts, but you didn't know it when you went back, unless you stopped to give them a second look, because they had been so personalized. Large aviaries built onto them, rooms built onto them, some of them 6 foot off the ground. There was a huge array of different configurations of lofts, but they were just a lot of them the small military lofts that had been customized. Do I simply go back to when he was but a small boy and holding his first pigeon? Should I talk about Charles Heitzman that way? I will. Be patient. I will unfold his life for you in this story. I will tell you the story of Charles Heitzman the best way a writer should, and that is simply to tell it in the most honest and straightforward way that I know how. To talk about a man's life is not natural to go straight to that person's beginning and to chronologically follow it to its end. No, when you and I sat down to talk, and there you are now listening to me, about someone we knew and loved, we talk about them in many ways. We go back and forth in their lives. And so you will find me in this story that I'm telling you, talking about my mentor, Mr. Heitzman. I can only write about that man in one way, and that is my way. How many racing pigeons did Charles Heitzman own in his life? 10,000? 100,000? The answer is clear. He owned all the pigeons, if not in his lofts, then in his dreams. I will start this beginning of Charles Heitzman when he was elderly and in his 80s. My method of giving you his early life will be subtle and sprinkled with long-held secrets. I will continue to ask my reader to be patient, for that is the mark of a great pigeon man, and we owe Mr. Heitzman that much. I will be employing one of the modes of storytelling which goes back and forth in time, and in this doing you will learn more and come to know Charles Heitzman in a way which has never been told. What fate it was that I ever met him, and fate more still that I should be now telling this story so many years later, now that I'm into my 70s myself. It was May 1st, 1980, when I left with my wife. Chesting in my pockets were 3 ink pens and 3 more notepads. I was once again headed in my Chevy van to visit my old friend Charles Heitzman. He had written to me asking me to please come and spend a full day and write his life story. I sensed whatever I would write would somehow be important, but I certainly could not foresee that it would be so 40 years later as I'm telling you now. I was honored because certainly he was quite particular about the way he presented himself, conducted himself, and especially so when it came to whatever was written about him. He was very particular that everything was honest and correct and to his satisfaction when anything was ever written about him. He wanted to read it and proof it and make sure that there was no mistakes. It was the opening week of Churchill Downs when I came, the horse racing capital of the world, a time when the blood of all Kentuckians runs high as the state of Kentucky blooms into a mad array of color and festivities, and the pastures all throughout the landscape are they burn green. The dogwood trees, the beautiful dogwood trees, they wax white, and the tulip popular trees fill their branches with pale green and yellow and orange flowers. The angels themselves in heaven sing for all that they're worth, and on God's strictest order, the sun does shine bright on dear old Kentucky. That day, Chestine and I drove across a small but handsomely arch-designed bridge over a trout-filled creek, upwards towards a small forested hill onto Mr. Heitzman's circular driveway. This spacious countryside estate was located off Chenoweth Run Road outside Jeffersontown, Kentucky. We parked beside Mr. Heitzman's Spanish-style home, and there waiting for us stood the small man, neatly attired, as usual, in his dress white shirt and tie, smiling as he always did upon seeing us. After handshakes and hugs, we walked a few steps, which took us to the back corner of his home, where a large bell was mounted in the air. For many years, Agnes, Mr. Heitzman's wife, had rang that bell to signal for when he should come in from the lofts and back down to the house. Meal times, important phone calls, and other matters, that bell would ring. Agnes was now gone, having suffered before dying with a series of breathing disorders, and now Bernice, Mr. Heitzman's daughter, was the one person who lived with him, and she is the person that would ring that bell. We began our walk up through the rows of stately eastern and red cedar trees, which Mr. Heisman had planted on both sides of the concrete walkway, which he had poured down soon after moving into his new home, which had been some 50 years ago. It was a special walk through the trees, as they offered a wonderful, distinct, sweet cedar smell. As we walked, we could glimpse here and there between the trees and the many lofts. Mr. Heitzman had come to name this area Cedar Point. Cedar Point was like the follow the yellow brick road, and for a racing pigeon fancier, it was nothing short of heaven. Angling to our right, we saw one of the dominant and magnificent trees in his area. It was a huge, giant tulip poplar tree, Kentucky state tree, and it was heavily laden in its distinct, squared-off, lime-colored leaves and tulip flower-like blooms, which were now casting a shade over several of Heitzman's lofts. Just off behind one side of the tree stood a two-story, white-painted concrete block widowhood loft, and away from it, a freestanding building recognized as Mr. Heitzman's library. This library was much the center of our concern on this day, besides being close to one of the truest Southern gentlemen we had ever met, a diligent working and very successful businessman, now retired, a Kentucky colonel who had operated his businesses from two locations, and America's most famous and most respected pigeon flyer, breeder, and international salesman of his own family of racing pigeons. In fact, Charles Heitzman had been buying imported pigeons as early as 1918 during World War I. As we continued to follow Mr. Heitzman from loft to loft, we were amazed at his brilliant memory. He knew everyone and everything in the sport. And when it came to his own birds, heavens, he knew all there was to know. Band numbers, pedigrees, physical features, performances, and I swear he could point out the smallest feature about a pigeon and leave you in empty wonderment as to how he noticed it first, and you never saw it at all. He was, for all intent and purpose, his colony of racing pigeons, and they, him, each reflecting each other. There was not a single pigeon he owned in which he did not have an intimate relationship. All around the estate, this magnificent, beautiful countryside estate, Mr. Heisman maintained a well-manicured bluegrass lawn. As we continued to follow him around on that lawn, near so many of his neatly arranged and elaborately constructed purple martin boxes, he paused to show us on those poles where those boxes were, which held the boxes, and the many of the years of dates that he had written on them, marking down the date each year that the martins had returned back to him after having flown away on their annual migration from these boxes. Mr. Heisman was a bird lover in every way, and he was proud of his martins, which added grace to the skies and also helped keeping the mosquitoes away from his racing pigeons. Out in the center of the lawn was a mounted mirror-like silvery spear, some 3 feet in diameter, reflecting the sun's rays in every direction. "My racers can spot that 20 miles out," spoke Heitzman. "It's a good marker for them on race days." As Mr. Heisman paused, a flock of his veteran racers circled, their fast wings cutting the air and creating a whistling sound over our heads. There was nothing quite like it. It excited your blood if you were a pigeon man. and drawing closer, we began to hear from his many lofts and from the racers resting on the boughs of his shady tulip poplar tree. So many soft coos from so many feathered Spartans. Gentle birds cocked their heads, eyeing us, while others conversed with their brooding mates in the most confidential of manner. The temperature that day was about 90 degrees. It seemed to have little effect on Mr. Heitzman as he remained patient, continuing to treat us with grandfather kindness. When the birds circling above Mr. Heitzman's home entered the magnificent main loft, he turned and said, "Just a first-class hobby. That's all this is. It is first class because it's a breeding game, and also because it's right here at my home, Cedar Point. It's a hobby which has kept me young, has kept me alive. There is nothing in this world quite like it." As Charles Heitzman grew from a youthful lad into a spirited young man, he went into the bakery business. He was one of those happy-natured and smart people who simply loved life. And because of his inventive hard work, he soon became successful, having available funds on which he could spend towards his life's passion, racing pigeons. He would advertise in American and English journals for older books and magazines. Many of these older editions, some printed before his birth, were obtained from widows of pigeon racers who sold their late husbands' books and journal collections to him. All of these early acquisitions I could see were now inside of his famous Heitzman library. After collecting all the books and journals for nearly a quarter of a century, Mr. Heitzman then decided in 1942, during the war, to build his often dreamed of about library. My decision came at a difficult time, he informed me, because materials were hard to get. Come by as the United States was engaged in World War II, he informed. Nevertheless, Mr. Heitzman began his effort to acquire material for that building. This tan-colored solid brick block stone structure stands 32 feet by 20 feet, and there's a small front porch with the black painted wrought iron fencing around it. Under a small decorative roof, the windows on either side of the doorway are covered by awnings to help protect the materials inside the hot southern sunlight. Outside, leading up to the library, was a long, narrow paved walkway, which also leads up to the slight hill to the breeding lofts, as well as to the main flying lofts. A walkway then continues past a flowering urn and up to several chairs and benches appropriately placed outside the doors of his library. Over the many years, from day to day, from a single individual to groups small and large, several thousand of Charles Heitzman's friends and racing pigeon colleagues had relaxed in those chairs and benches. They would sit and stand in the area, often watching his pigeons, and play near atop their lofts as they would discuss in detail every subject under the sun involving racing pigeons. Mr. Heitzman did not begin to have any rival who owned such a complete and thorough knowledge of the sport over the world from its earliest inception to its very day as he did. He knew from the beginning of pigeons all the way up to where he was at now. He was breaking barriers and busting the ice and setting a groundwork for the future, for where the sport is now. I'm not so sure that he would love where the sport is at now because of the one loft races and so forth, but certainly he would have been possibly in them. He loved his pigeons as a child loves its puppies. Charles Heitzman's you could ask him any question about a pigeon and he would be glad to answer it. It didn't bother him. He would take out long periods of time to go into great detail to explain to you every little thing that you may not have even thought was within that question. Anyone who was afforded the nothing but pleasurable opportunity and given permission to spend a day with him at his loft soon came to acknowledge and appreciate that Kentucky did not have the finest racehorses in the world. Yes, they did, but they also did have the finest racing pigeons, and all because of one man, Mr. Charles Heitzman. He was unquestionably the greatest pigeon flyer, the greatest pigeon man in the United States. You only had to spend a day with him to quickly see that. Although solidly built, every brick and stone in that library had a defect in it. The only way it was possible for me to buy brick back in 1942, spoke Mr. Heisman, was for me to take the rejects from the brickyard, since the complete ones were used for military projects. The bricks were glazed on one side and unglazed on the other. I constructed this entire library so that these small chips seen on the bricks were laid on the outside, so the inside stones were perfect. Inside the library, there were 2 rooms. The largest room, which was immediately seen upon entering the library, had several windows and contained a large stone fireplace. I haven't had that fireplace working for a long time, continued Mr. Heisman, but I might have it back in good order if I decide to have a caretaker live here. Some person who could organize this library and watch over all my birds. Robbie, you wouldn't be interested, would you? I sure would love to have you do that. I would pay you well. I smiled at Mr. Heitzman, and he smiled back, and then Chastain smiled at us both. We all knew the impossibility of such a position, but it was a grand knowing that Charles Heitzman thought of me as such as he did. In more modern times, a heater had been added to keep the warmth in that building during the winter months of the year. To the right was another smaller room which housed his refrigerator. I keep bottled Coca-Colas in there, he said. You know, and I also keep fresh cabbage too for my pigeons. They love it. It's healthy for them and one of my secrets for winning. If I wanted, I could place a fold-up bed in here and a kitchen in here, and my total cost on this building in 1942 was about $2,300. Around 20 years ago, Mr. Heisman had built another small building behind his library. This building primarily houses shipping crates, shipping labels, and all the equipment and paraphernalia necessary to ship birds across the country and internationally in a fashion such as most fanciers have never seen or done anywhere else. Each crate that he created is separately labeled with feed and water present for every bird in the crate. In addition, a dressing is added to the bottom of the crates, and they are constructed in such a way that if the birds are anything other than squeakers, they are invariably separated and sent into individual compartments so that the cocks do not peck each other and the hens are protected during the trip. Many of the crates are so elaborately done that Mr. Heisman usually has a loft man spend several hours a week just working and constructing on them to keeping to his high standards for shipping pigeons. Another unique feature about his library building itself is a small pigeon cemetery just to the right of the entrance. There stands a small headstone and several porcelains, articulately painted pigeon figures with their caption, "They fly no more." 3 of his most famous pigeons are buried here: Headwind, Hurry Home, and Heatwave. The dates of these pigeons flew were in the late 1940s, but their breeding records have subsequently established them as well-known pigeons throughout America and the racing pigeon world. Each of these birds had flown 504 air miles on the day, said Mr. Heisman, all the way from Vicksburg, Mississippi to here in Jeffersontown. I gave my champions names, all starting with the H, standing for Heisman, you know. One was Headwind. And he was the only bird in our club to make it home on the day. He had to fly over 14 hours against a tough headwind in order to make it. His blood has been solid gold for me and many others. A few years ago, I'm going to stop for just a second and talk about a few years ago, long after Mr. Heisman's death, Headwind's dried up leg came up for sale on eBay, and as I remember, This one leg brought nearly $2,000 cash for a dead pigeon's leg with a band on it. Just to give you an idea of how popular and honored and almost sacred Charles Heitzman's famous pigeons were. While we were all sitting out on the benches, going back to my story, just outside the library, the view was very captivating to our right. This giant tulip poplar tree, which was affording us all this shade during this hot weather, as pleasant breezes came through and also comforted our presence. And just below the tulip poplar was a small breeding loft, which owned a set of double entry doors. Inside his loft, some of Heisman's more recent famous racers had lived, including High Seeger and High Irene, as well as High Woodsider. All three of these pigeons over the past decade had bred winners for many fanciers around the country. Charles Seeger of Donaldson, Pennsylvania, had bred and flown High Seeger and High Irene. High Seeger was the bird had won two 500-mile races in that anthracite concourse, and High Irene had won the AU Hall of Fame sprint champion. High Woodsider was a hen directly out of the English long-distance champion Woodsider. Mr. Heisman had intercrossed these three pigeons and had developed a substrain from them which proved their worth over the years. The next loft to the right of the library was the very large flying racing loft, which Mr. Heisman had been photographed on the stairs of so many times and been in newspapers and magazines, and everyone knew the loft almost as well as they knew the Eiffel Tower. If you were a pigeon man, you recognized that main racing loft of his. It was an icon of the racing pigeon lofts. He'd used it over the past 40 years. This was the famous loft which so many racing pigeon flyers across the world had seen in so many magazines and had secretly wished that they themselves owned. This loft had 5 large sections and over the years had held thousands of racing pigeons. Many memorable stories had come from this loft since over the years Mr. Heisman's records and famous birds had resided here. This loft was built smart, beautifully constructed, wide steps leading up to the front, landing boards very high above the ground, which the racers loved, and multiple aviaries of all sizes on top of for the racers to observe the sky and their surroundings, and an extremely healthy ventilation system which had been employed throughout all the planning. In a few minutes we were on the large roof of his main loft. At first the pigeons there flew away, but soon backpacking and picking up handfuls of selected grain Mr. Heisman had scattered on top of the loft. These birds aren't nesting, he said, so they get out on the ground. They get out in good weather for exercise and plenty of sunshine. This is my flying loft to which birds return from a race. Inside I have a small electric trap which rings a buzzer inside my home when a bird returns. But it is better when I can sit in front of the library and watch for the return. It isn't hard to estimate about when to expect them, especially when they have taken several flights and begin to know well the return journey. I suppose I should have told you that if birds are not good flyers, they're not kept here. No way. These have to be special pigeons. A bird has to be a great flyer. A bird which does not return in good time from a race is eliminated automatically. We all continued to gaze at the surroundings as we stood on top of Mr. Heisman's main racing loft. From here, I could survey much of his 35-acre estate and note the more than 400 soldierly-like cedar trees. A melancholy of breeze continued as all around us listened to the soft coo of so many gentle pigeons. This loft cost me $1,000 and $1,500 in 1939, Charles Heitzman informed me. I don't know what it would cost today to build. My guess, more than $30,000, maybe more than that. Once we went back into the loft, Mr. Heisman proudly showed off a pair of 7-day-old babies, sparsely covered with golden hair, and deftly slipped into his famous trademark, KY aluminum band on one of the bird's legs. In a week from now, the mother hen of these two will lay a second set of eggs. Nowadays, I allow each pair to lay 3 sets of eggs per breeding season. I am retiring from the race game. I am getting up in years. I'll now be mostly just a breeder. But not just any breeder. I still take great pride in breeding the finest racing pigeons that exist. The whole magnificent estate was surrounded by mature white pines as well, and eastern and red cedar trees as well, as many native flowering trees. Again, those white dogwoods and the red buds, which were just to the south. Tucked away at the distant end of the yard was Mr. Heisman's original breeding loft. A large walk-in aviary was ornately built and attached, present there with the roof to shade the birds from the hot sun. The floor is solid concrete, and it is washed down daily and allowed to dry long before allowing any birds to enter, Mr. Heisman said. It is a loft built to make my birds smile when they come out. He continued, smiling himself. A happy pigeon has a better chance of being healthy. Pigeons are just like us. They enjoy relaxing. Many racers, save for breeding, have lived here all their entire lives, and many of my best flyers have spent their late years here intermingling their bloodlines. Throughout the day, as we visited Mr. Heisman and as I continued to write notes, the bell at his house would ring, and Mr. Heisman would receive an average of 6 to 7 telephone calls per day from racing pigeon flyers from all over the world asking him about his breeding stock, the ability to purchase few birds from him, the availability of his birds, or questions about the health and vigor of their own pigeon and what advice he might be able to give them. Mr. Heisman is such a friendly and interesting person, and he owns such exuberance for the racing pigeons that many flyers call him up simply to talk and pass a little time with America's most recognized leading expert with racing pigeons. That was Mr. Heitzman. Birds, 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 pigeons, pigeons, pigeons. Mr. Heitzman has thousands of books and magazines on racing pigeons, and he is the one man who has read every word in each of them. In fact, it's incredible how he can pull a book off the shelf and quote information contained on certain pages from so many of them. He has absolutely studied all these books diligently over many decades. If ever any man truly knew all there was to know about racing pigeons, as mysterious at times that can be, it had to be Charles Paul Heitzman. Once back inside Mr. Heitzman's library, he continued to answer my questions. That ceramic statue, he explained, I paid an artist to create it. He modeled it after Hurry Home. A woman in Texas sent me the painting there of Old 51. I named him that because he was hatched in 1951, and I banded him AU 51KY 51051. Old 51 was a magnificent red Sions cock with the slight little frills on his covers. Many of my best breeders have had that characteristic. It says to me they have a lot of feather, almost too much. A Chinese gentleman reproduced Old 51's photo made from small, colorful seashells. And yes, I thought, as I continued looking throughout his library, pigeon fanciers from all over the world had sent him all sorts of gifts, including a beautiful hand-knit sweater owning a pigeon, one of his pigeons knitted in the center of it, as well as hand-painted pigeon tie. One of Mr. Heitzman's top prize books was The Illustrated Book of Pigeons. I believe that this book and many of the other materials mentioned are now housed in the American Racing Pigeon Museum in Oklahoma, this book was published in 1876. Its color plates were still quite vivid. Among his collection were every monthly issue of the American Racing Pigeon News from 1898 to the present. Some of the pigeon books went as far back as 1858, before the American Civil War, and in the back room was a highly regarded box he rarely produced to anyone to see. This box had seen many years. Mr. Heisman had handled it with the greatest of care. I have some of my most important and precious letters from the well-established racing pigeon men of their time in this box, he divulged. I still have, for example, much of the original correspondence from John W. Logan, from whom I bought some of my original birds when I was a boy. And as a matter of, not as a boy, but as I grew up. As a matter of fact, At Logan's close-out sale in 1925, I purchased two birds for a total price of more than $700, which at that time was an incredible price for that day and time. But during that time, I was selling pigeons off imports, and good imports they were, as early as the 1920s. I was always earning money from the sale of my babies from imports and then reinvesting it into more pigeons. It was really hard to believe, but true, that I was paying such prices for imported pigeons and then selling them to American fancy at prices the working man could afford. I may have had more to do with establishing the pigeon sport and dismantling the disseminating the well-bred youngsters all throughout the United States than any other pigeon man who has ever lived. Also in the box were many letters from Paul and Robert Sions, as well as those from Guillaume Stassert of Belgium, who Mr. Heisman had bought pigeons from over the years on several different occasions. In the book Stasserts by Charles Heitzman, he remembered his reader of many imported Stassert pigeons he bought, and the difficulty it had convincing Mr. Stassert to ever sell pigeons to him. Those letters, mentioned Mr. Heisman, not only described the birds which were imported by me, but also the birds' performances and pedigrees, all in handwritten form by Mons Stassert himself. I value these letters the most of any letters I own. In these letters, Mons Stassert gave me instructions on mating his birds, which he eventually shipped over, as well as his recommendations in training and racing them. I follow Mons Stassert's instructions explicitly, and because I did so, I was able to develop a very formidable strain of Stasserts here in America. Some of my most famous Stasserts were Abrin and Modesta and Diapre. They were birds that I imported from Mons Stassert himself. I developed his strain here in America to fly 500 miles on the day, and as I developed a number of birds who had performed that task admirably, I might add, I then went on to proceed with crossing them with some of my family of Sions, which had been also performing in the same manner. It was through these crosses with the Sions and Stasserts that I developed so many great performances in the 1940s and in the 1950s and in the 1960s. It was also through these crosses and through selling this line-bred pure strain to fanciers who then crossed them themselves that the Sions Stassert blood spread throughout America. In time, thousands of flyers were racing them and winning thousands of race day victories. I wanted to mention here that right after I had written the interview, I received a June 12, 1980 Racing Pigeon Bulletin. The issue showed that only 2 day birds to come home from 600 miles in the New York Concourse. Both of those birds were from Mr. Heisman, Sions, and Stasserts. I asked Mr. Heisman about breeding methods, and he replied, I developed a mating technique whereby I retained several youngsters from each of the most reliable breeders, and then I crossed them back onto the reliable breeders of the same strain, or I sometimes outcross them with the other strain. I keep my pigeons very healthy and well. Some of my birds, which were great racers, live here beyond 28 years of age. For example, Heather and High Time and his twin are all 3 sons out of Headwind and Heatweb in the 1950s. Those 3 birds flew over 500 miles 20 times, and between the 3 of them, they went on to produce a long line of winners for many people. In 1977, Heisman had presented to me with his last daughter of High Time, who was in herself around 8 years of age. High Time was over 20 years of age when I last saw him in Mr. Heisman's loft in 1978. Through excellent care, I am often able to breed a little longer with pigeons than are most fanciers. I often have cockbirds which are fertile at 15 years of age. One bred babies for me when he was 17. I have noticed over the years that quite often an excellent racer will also be a pigeon that will live a long time. When I mated the 3 children and grandchildren of these racers together, I was able to sell relatives of these birds to anyone in the country who wanted them. At any rate, I must put in my box of letters back up. I really need to have them in a lockbox. Heisman watched as I continued to write. I became an author myself, he said, around 1928. One of my booklets, Young Bird Training Methods, is now in its seventh reprint. All my books, especially the ones on Sions and Stassers, have sold thousands of copies. I want to stop here just for a second when I'm telling this story. Uh, you know, Stassert was an incredible pigeon flyer, and when the war broke out, he was going to have to give up his pigeons. The Germans were overrunning Belgium, and he committed suicide over that, and they had a large sale of his birds. His whole loft was so, but he loved his birds so much that he couldn't stand it, and he committed suicide. And it had a huge effect on Mont Sion as well in France. I'll talk more about that later on, but Sion didn't commit suicide, but I'll talk more about what he did do when World War II broke out, and what each of these two fanciers, where Heisman was getting his birds, what they did when the Germans were coming at them. I want to get back again. I'm jumping back and forth a little bit, and I'm hoping that I'm holding your attention. I'm trying to tell the story of the most famous pigeon flyer that ever lived in the United States. Doing it a little bit for history. I think it should be recorded because he connected the very origins of the racing pigeons up to where they're at today with me. One of the more interesting features of the library was this very large metal filing cabinet which housed many of his sales brochures. These go back for over a half century, and it was very interesting to read and notice his early attention to the Logans and see that his sales brochures, which were published in the 1920s, his success with the sales brochures spread the word of his birds he had available to all the corners of the world. Logan was one of the strains he was first into in a big way. I noted that some of his birds were being sold at the price of $30 in the 1920s, and this was his selling price for young birds. Even into the late 1970s, prior to our recent wave of inflation, not to mention what the inflation is like now. I wrote this article I'm talking about, I wrote several years ago, because you know how much inflation has gone up just in the last several years. His selling price for young birds back in the 70s, these were in many ways were the birds of the day and a fancier could import back in the 1920s. By the early 1930s, however, he was looking for greater accomplishments with his racing pigeons and became interested in the Sions and the Stassert strains. His interest also grew because he realized that Mons Stassert and Paul Sion exchanged birds themselves. They were friends, and in order to strengthen their bloodlines, they would trade each other out on their top birds a lot of time. And it was through this ideal that Heitzman himself developed separate Heitzman Sion and Heitzman Stassert strains here in America, for one ability to cross them and for each other to keep them straight. They were successful any way you went with them. Mr. Heitzman's sales lists go on through the 1930s and 40s, and a never-ending stream showing beautiful photographs of his champions, as well as listing the remarkable flying records. I never missed a single year in producing those sales lists, spoke Mr. Heitzman. Those sales lists are now part of American racing pigeon history. They show many photographs of pigeons, either famous for their racing performances or for their proven breeding ability. Sometimes I would place a photo of a young bird in the brochures which was special in appearance, though not proven, but of perfect conformity. Pedigrees were always carefully kept on each pigeon, and sometimes I would put these pedigrees in the brochures. Occasionally a great pigeon of my blood would be brought back and given to me as a gift from some flyer. This was always a special moment for me, and I was always happy to use the bird later on in my breeding program. You know, how many people win a great race and then come back and bring that winner of that race and give it back to someone? You know, that's how much Charles Heitzman was respected and loved, and people wanted to see him succeed and continue to go for him. Like I said, he was a different pigeon flyer. Proven flyers, especially the champions, have always been prized by me for their breeding. From the best come the best, and apple never falls far from the trees. You know, he said that so many times, and there's so much truth in it. The importance here is that I want you to remember is that Heisman believed strongly in breeding out of pigeons that were successful themselves, birds that had flown, the year before or 2 years before. He wanted to breed out of those pigeons that had proven themselves. He was real adamant about that. And as far as people stating that pigeons, I just read in the Racing Pigeon Digest, this one guy, he wrote in there and said that pigeons, all great pigeons have a huge conglomeration of pigeons in their background in order to be champions. That's someone who's not been patient with pigeons. You can keep a single family of birds very easily so, but if you do that, you have to keep a very careful eye on what is the best each year from one year to the next, and you need to fly those birds from one year to the next. It's a long, patient game to do that, to keep one family and to stay within that family. But certainly you can be extremely successful and have the best pigeons in the world if you stay within one family. You have more control on the genetics, and it's just a matter of who you are as a fancier. You don't have to go out and be hybrid, buying pigeons here and willy-nilly, buying one over there and one over here and doing all this nonsense in order to be successful. You can stay within a successful family of birds, but you have to weed out anything that's weak. You have to weed out anything that doesn't prove itself. And you have to, for me, I have to raise a lot of birds. And then I go through them, and I only keep a handful from one year to the next. But that's how you keep a successful family of pigeons. It's not an instant success. And that's what so many people in America want. And that's what this guy writing about. He prides himself on buying a bird here and buying a bird there and buying another bird over here. These guys totally reinventing themselves over and over and over and over again, and going nowhere. It's like a dog chasing its tail. In the library, in Heisman's library, on the special tables and desks and shelves and countless, there were scattered pigeon memoirs. On one table, there are over 30 trophies won by him back in the days when he was in competition. Those trophies represent individual wins at any and all distances, as well as average speed wins, birds of the year wins, and all wins imaginable. These are in every individual size and shape imaginable, with marble bases, walnut bases, silver and gold colored pigeons atop most of them. And on the other side of the room, there were 3 large bookcases with cabinets above them. The cabinets housed an extensive variety of trophies and awards, including an interesting collection of plates and pigeons that were depicted on them. Other items were porcelain figures, which reflected the pigeons they were crafted after. All had been kept and maintained in these cabinets, and for many years for protection. Above the fireplace is an extremely large photograph of Mons Stassert. His arms crossed and his bald head and beard looked sternly over the library. That expression of Mons Stassert's face has often reminded me of the absolute regularity of a successful pigeon fancier that he must go by, spoke Mr. Heisman. Something in a pigeon's life seems to make it want to perform better, if that bird has always knows what to expect. Some of the paintings on the walls were watercolors, and some of the oil paintings and some were photographs and frames. Mr. Heisman, over the years, has had many people send him photographs of his birds that they were winning with, which were of his bloodlines. An oil painting of his twin, of the famous 3 Stasserts from Headwind and Heatwave, hangs on the wall to the left of the fireplace. He was 22 years old when I handled him in 1978. He is a beautiful blue checkered cock with very strong shoulders and back. He is making pigeon history around the world. Hanging around and near the fireplace are multiple plaques and trophies and citations concerning his racing pigeons. On the fireplace mantel was a large photograph, similar to the ones that are there seen in Belgium and other countries, Europe. A picture of Charles Heitzman himself surrounded by 8 of his famous pigeons, all in the same portrait. And above that is a plaque that has first place ribbons and reflecting 8 racing homers he entered in a large pigeon show in 1947. In another corner of the room are several mementos from Japan, China,
and other Asian countries. Odd, but very few people in America begin to realize just how popular Mr. Heisman was throughout Asia and how many birds he must reserve in his breeding every year to be shipped to Asian fancy friends. The foreign demand on his birds is one of the reasons why he retains 50 pair of breeders even after his death, even after his 1979 illness, an almost complete sale, so that he might at least satisfy the needs of these fanciers. In addition, he has so many requests nationally for his birds that he said to me, I sold over 500 pigeons in 1979 for a total of $65,000. And I should say here, about 2 years ago, I started a website, Heisman Sions. It wasn't 2 years ago. It's been about, 6 years ago now. So I wrote this article about 4 years ago. But anyway, during this time, at that time, I'd had about 200,000 hits. And now I should tell everyone, I've had over 1 million hits. And probably that Heisman Sions website has had more hits on it than any other pigeon website in the world. You only need to go to the internet and type in Heisman Sions to see what I'm talking about. You know, it's not me so much. There's people that want to know about Charles Heitzman. He's still that loved. Anyone that says that the Sions are gone or Charles Heitzman's gone are very, very, very mistaken. All they have to do is go to that website. And, anything that's had 1 million hits is not gone. Another interesting and unusual item with the library was the small-scale replica of one of his pigeon lofts. It had a sign over the top of it, Racing Pigeons, Charles Heitzman, Jeffersontown, Kentucky. This model loft is made to scale and actually has purchases in it, as well as feeders and grit containers. A couple of dozen small, nicely painted porcelain pigeons dot the roof landing board on the replica loft. This pigeon loft is a pride of the library. It has several dowed windows and doors, which makes it a true work of art. Hanging on the small wall above the model pigeon loft is a plaque from the American Racing Pigeon Union. It was awarded to him in 1975. Voting him, he was awarded to Charles. It says he was awarded to Charles Heitzman for his contribution to the development and breeding of racing pigeons throughout America. In addition, he was awarded another plaque from the National Pigeon Association in 1964 as he won the Master Breeder Award. As a tribute to Cherami, the World War I pigeon hero, Mr. Heisman has a book which is now out of print written about Cherami by Marion B. Cawthorne. Also, in one of his cabinets is a plate which has a picture of Cherami on it with his damaged leg and his medal awarded by the French government for his message, which he had saved several hundred lives. See these, spoke Mr. Heisman, showing me some old ticket-like pieces of paper. These are gasoline ration stamps which were given to me during World War II by the government. I received them from the contribution of racing pigeons, both to England and China. And I want to stop here again and talk about Cherami. I was one of the first people back in the 60s. I wrote a very long, detailed article for the Racing Pigeon Bulletin about Cherami, where I talked about Colonel Whittlesey and the Lost Battalion and all of them being in the Argonne Forest. That article can be found possibly if you do enough research in the Racing Pigeon Digest. And then a few years ago, one of the articles I wrote, which was richly illustrated, came out in the Racing Pigeon Digest, and it's a ghost story. It's called a Tail Feather, and it's a story I created in my mind about the ghost of Cherami coming back, and I think it's one of the better stories that I've created, fictional stories that I've written for the pigeon magazines. That appeared in the Racing Pigeon Digest, A Tail Feather by No Sweat. Throughout the day that I was with Charles Heitzman, while I was writing this story, taking some notes, I was given permission to catch and handle many of Mr. Heitzman's racing pigeons. Each bird that I caught had its own Heisman qualities, which I earlier mentioned to you about. It was uncanny. It was like talking about people's children. There were many reds, silver mealies, blues, blue and black checkers, and a few white flights or splashes. He had no grizzles, And we talked about that at length. There are no true, pure Sion grizzles. I never keep a bird with white on him unless he's exceptional. And every now and then you will see a chocolate or two, he said to me. Everyone thinks they are Bastings, but they're not. My chocolates are always Stassards. I breed some great Stassards, which are chocolates, which generally fly exceptionally well. Heitzman looked down at my hands. Do you have dry hands, he asked. A good pigeon man should always have bone-dry hands when handling pigeons. Here, take this block of magnesia, rub on that. It will dry your hands like powdered chalk. Mr. Heitzman then handed me a wide-barred blue cock with dark violet and green eyes and remarked, Remember that eye, he said to me. That is a breeder's eye. I have bred a great many great racers out of pigeons that own such an eye. Leaving the main racing loft, Mr. Heisman, Chastain, and I journeyed to his 2-story block loft. I flew widowhood out there, he mentioned, while looking up towards the steps to the second floor of the loft. Besides us, near those steps, which lead to the second floor, was a large walk-in chain-link fence constructed Avery. Everyone knows my famous KY bands, he said. You know, I've never had any of those lost birds ever reported to me, he smiled, repeating himself. There might have been a half dozen pigeon breeders in the United States with anything approaching my setup, he continued. But they have not been quite like what I maintain, or for nearly as long. Maybe one or two others who have put in as much money as I have, time as I have. Maybe. The way I go about banding my birds every year is routine and simple. One matter, I normally double band all my birds on one leg. I have my name and address band on the other leg. I place my KY band where I place my KY band. I order 500 to 700 bands every year. And when I do, I start the band numbers off with the year which I'm ordering. This way, when I'm handling any of my birds at any time, I know what year they were born and about what month they were born by just looking at the bands, looking at those band numbers. For example, in 1951, all my bands started out with 51. Since I ordered 700 bands, the first bird banded was AU 51 KY 51001. The last bird would be AU 51 KY 517000. In 1970, my bands would begin with the number 70, and my first bird banded would be AU 70 KY 70001. This banding system has always worked extremely well for me. Do you see up there on that top step of the loft? I once fell off that. Not a happy landing, I'll tell you. I was in the hospital for a long while. I loved the loft when I first built it, but I would not recommend that kind of loft to anyone. Concrete block lofts are not healthy for birds compared to the wooden lofts. The concrete blocks actually sweat. Moisture in a loft is detrimental for pigeons. The air is different in a concrete block loft. You can smell the difference. You can sense it. You can smell it. You can taste it. It's never as good as it is in a wooden loft. People spend too much money on building lofts. Lofts do not need to be heavily built or expensive. Pigeons don't care if you have new lumber or old boards. My birds love those small army lofts. I have as much as any loft site that I've ever had. As long as the loft stays bone dry and there's plenty of fresh air and nice aviaries affording them enjoyment, sun and rain, that's all you need for a pigeon's happiness. Pushing a stick, which in turn pushed a piece of plastic in place, which also in turn prevented the birds in the loft access to the aviary, Mr. Heitzman entered the bottom of the 2-story loft. Just like the head, some unseen rattlesnake, his hand suddenly struck out of nowhere, and all in one motion he came down and grabbed and then gently held one of his magnificent Stassards. Ah, he said back to me. He came down, he said to me, contentment painting entire, feel how strong this bird is. Feel how tight his vents are, and how perfect the depth of that keel is. No sweat. Remember this pigeon well. There is a racer. This is the kind of bird you want for long distance racing. Remember it, hold it, keep that memory in your mind forever. This is what you want. How many pigeons do you have right now? I asked Charlie. Around 500 right now, Robbie. After the breeding season, I might have maybe as many as 1,000 birds, but I will easily sell well over half of them before next year. What strains? Well, be honest with you, I keep mostly Sions. They have long been by far my most popular strain. Not only are the Sions great long distance champions, they are also my most beautiful pigeons. There are many variations within them. A very identifiable strain once you learn them, and they have had such a history in World War II. Paul Sion gave his birds to the French underground, and at the end of the war, he got what he wanted back. His son went back to get them. Actually, he didn't. But I have many Stasserts too, and several Van Brauns. You could call what I have a Heitzman strain. I can trace any bird I have back at least 10 generations, all with my breeding. And if you've bred all the birds in 10 generations, they're certainly your strain and not someone else's. All throughout the day, Mr. Heisman's phone would periodically ring. With no exaggeration, I am certain at least 20 different fanciers from all over the world were calling, asking for his birds. I could only wonder how many calls he received in a full year, not to mention the correspondence. Charles Heitzman certainly was in strong demand, in demand like no one I could begin to imagine. And always, however, Mr. Heisman had to communicate. It was always been done in his own special style, his own straightforwardness, and Heisman German class. In speech, he is modest and low tone, patient and precise. In matters pertaining to records and handwriting, no one could match him more than they could match his birds. His handwriting is quite unique. Like I said, it was almost artistic and flowery and elegant and expressive, creative and unique. It was just like him. He writes with a flair of style as easily identifiable as a Van Gogh painting. In an imagery life, I could have seen him writing as some Trappist monk hidden away in the mountains, concerned only in the beauty and craftsmanship of the writing itself, as well as the message. Everything Mr. Heisman writes is in depth, articulate, and exact, and to read Mr. Heisman's handwriting is genuinely a reflection of the man himself. Handsome in both its neat and gentle manner, and I should say that Mr. Heisman's life, he has maintained his handwritten correspondence as best as he could, even in the late part of his life. But I began to notice his beautiful handwriting to falter and somewhat shaky in structure. Mr. Heitzman's internal beautiful self was still in his handwriting, but I could see his age was creeping in and influencing his writing, as well as Mr. Heisman himself. It hurt me to see all this, knowing the fate of all of us. I happen to treasure the last letters from him the most, of more than the 650 handwritten letters that he wrote to me. I have a double-door system leading into most every loft, spoke Mr. Heitzman. Each door owns a device geared with springs and weights, always forcing each door to quickly reshut itself once it's been opened. Many of my prisoners are very valuable. It's quite rare for any pigeon to escape. Heisman was generally soft-spoken and most always serious, especially about his pigeons, but not so serious that he did not seem to constantly carry a smile. His personality was forceful, upbeat, and every way always positive. I was sure that these characteristics in large part were why he was successful in whatever he pursued. Without telling me over the many years that I knew him, I slowly discovered just how loving and grand a person Mr. Heisman had always been to his family during the last years of Agnes's, his wife, and she had horribly suffered from emphysema. She had required a good deal of attention, and in all ways Mr. Heisman had devoutly remained close to her side until the end. And Charles Heitzman's son, Charles Jr., had been given the family privileges of working with his father in the bakery business. I should say here, too, that as of this very day, the Heisman bakery business throughout Louisville and Jeffersontown, Kentucky remains the premier bakery in all of this area in Kentucky. Everyone in the Louisville and Jeffersontown area loves the Heisman bakeries, and been going there for generations. It's a landmark area when it comes to pies and cakes. People think of the Heisman bakeries to this day, generations and generations later. Before retiring to Stuart, Florida, Mr. Heisman's son, Mr. Heitzman, informed me that his son had done very well in the business, even better than he had done, both being millionaires. Authors note Mr. Heisman was a devout Catholic, very active in church. Every time I came to Mr. Heisman, he would eventually take me out to dinner. We would always have a fine meal, and always, he insisted, he paid for the tab. He would have it no other way. Mr. Heisman was proud of his German ancestry, fondly remembering and always reflective about both of his parents being immigrants. I remember one day when we were under the floor of his main loft in a dark place where he kept some large wicker training baskets and a few odds and ends, and there he leaned up on its end was that old wooden chest. That was my mother's chest, spoke Mr. Heisman. When she came from Germany, as I was given permission to open its door-like top, I noted the crude wooden drawers and deteriorated state. This is all my mother owned when she came to America. Her whole world was in that trunk, he informed. As I continued to walk and converse with Mr. Heisman, I looked at this small man with the white hair and the blue eyes, and I realized I was in the company of greatness. He was not a man who talked about politics, although I did notice in his library where Ronald Reagan had sent him a birthday greeting. He was not a fancier bent on one-upmanship. He didn't have to. He was the most honest fancier I had ever known, a fancier in his own quiet who had proven beyond question his breeding and racing prowess, a fancier who had given up quality after quality and yet somehow had always carefully managed to breed back even pigeons better than from one year to the next, successively breeding pigeons that were better and better and better, and yet still selling great pigeons along the way. Somehow he had an instinct on knowing how to breed the best pigeons. One of the things which Charles Heitzman had done over the years had influenced racing pigeon sport had been his contribution to literary works, namely the 5 books on racing pigeons which he authored. These books were the first books of their kind concerning the racing pigeon sport in America, and several have been revised over the years due to large part to the beautiful documentation of Sions and Stasser strains. These books also show detailed pedigrees as well as photographs and race records of many of the original Stasser pigeons and those of Mr. Heisman's Stassers. The Stasser book was first written by Charles Heitzman in 1939. Mr. Stasser died in 1939 from a suicide, but his reference work and strain of pigeons lived on through Charles Heitzman's effort. The Stasser strain was then self-published in 1944 and revised in 1964. It's 72 pages long and now a collector's item since it has not been reprinted in almost 20 years. Mr. Heisman himself has only had a couple of copies left in his library. In addition to the Stasser strain, the Sions reference book was published in the 7th edition in 1977. The first edition was published in 1932, and for almost 50 years now, more than that now, almost 60 years, the book has been the major reference book on Sions strain in America. It was republished in 1935, again in 1942, and then again in 1945. It was then in its 5th edition in 1959. Although the first Sions were imported by Lou Curtis, the fame of his strain has been greatly propagated through the publication of this book. The photographs of the classic reds and the red checkers and the silvers have become the favorites of many fanciers throughout the United States and the world. In addition to see these 2 major works on the 2 strains of racing pigeons that Charles Heitzman so successfully bred and crossed and flew even more successfully were followed up by 3 other books. Mr. Heitzman's young bird and training methods has been used by hundreds of flyers over the years. Mr. Heisman first wrote this book back in 1932, and it has been republished 7 times. It is estimated that this book has been sent to thousands of flyers throughout the world because for many years Mr. Heisman included it with his orders with pigeons, which were sent from his loft. In addition to the young bird training and methods, 2 other books were printed. Lofts for Racing Pigeons was printed by Charles Heitzman, self-published, and shows diagram of many lofts of his premises. The diagrams are quite detailed and allow fanciers to either design their lofts of similar nature or use concepts to build into their own lofts. Through this book, many of the ideals which he had incorporated for successful racing over the years have been well established in lofts throughout the United States. Mr. Heisman has championed such issues as good ventilation and skylights and special traps and cleaned feed, as well as internal hardware such as specially designed nest boxes and perches for the convenience of the birds, for their comfort, as well as ease in cleaning and helping to maintain a clean loft. Mr. Heisman also believes strongly in large aviaries so that birds have plenty of room to fly around and exercise within their own lofts. And I can't stress that enough, talking about large aviaries and the importance of them. I really believe that people should have 3 aviaries on a square rectangular loft, 2 on each side and a large one on the front, and the ones on the sides, you should be able to walk out into them. You want birds having all the fresh air they can possibly get in a loft to keep them happy. Over the years, Mr. Heisman, he tried out many different ideals on many different lofts. He has so many different types of lofts on his estate that there are some with doweled windows, some with cement floors, some with wooden floors, and one with metal floors, and one that he tried with graded floors. Of all the floors, he prefers a wooden floor. It was almost inevitable that Mr. Heisman would come to author such a popular book. In 1956, Mr. Heisman was designing lofts for stock birds. He spent great time and effort putting glass sashes on the front of open doweled doors, which had waterproof concrete floors, and roofing tar, which allowed for as much dryness as the loft as possible. In addition, roof overhangs of the 15 or more inches were commonplace. In 1969, a 60-foot long loft with large aviaries fitted with 1 inch by 1 inch welded sparrow-proof netting as well as running water was built. Soon thereafter, the 7th edition of Lofts for Racing Pigeons was published. The next book, which Charles Heitzman also frequently sent to so many flyers who purchased his birds, was his breeding record book. In this book, up to 30 or more pairs can be registered with columns for dates and their eggs, when hatched, band numbers, color, sex, and the paternal remarks concerning the children outlined. In addition to that, space at the top is left an important data such as pair number, dated mate, strain, and pedigrees. All of this information is considered in a very handy and useful breeding book, which again has become very popular with fanciers throughout the country. Charlie, I asked, didn't you tell me you sold birds to the movie star Andy Devine? I continued to ask him. I loved Andy Devine in the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. You know, he was the sheriff there, and loved everything about Andy, that voice of his and his mannerisms, and he added such a comedy relief to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And without him, that movie wouldn't have been quite as great as it was. No sweat. Andy Devine came here, I don't know how many times, but certainly several. He was a very fine person. I have a photograph of us with a Stassert that he bought for me. That picture is in here in the library. Andy told me that when he was a boy, he grew up in the country. He grew up in Texas, I think near a mine or something. He said that when he was a boy, he had pigeons. He was playing around near that mine, and he stole 4 sticks of dynamite. He kept the dynamite, hid for a while from his parents and everybody, and then one day he caught a cat. That cat had been sneaking around in his loft for killing his pigeons, and he told me that he tied all 4 of those sticks of dynamite together and then tied them onto that cat that had been killing his pigeons. He lit the dynamite and then threw the cat down on the ground. And do you know that cat ran straight towards his pigeon loft and hid underneath of it? And a few seconds later, the dynamite exploded, blowing up the cat and his loft and every single pigeon that he owned. Here at the Heisman Loft, spoke Charles Heitzman, I get many visitors from all parts of the country and Canada, as well as many foreign visits. I have people come up from the Bahamas, from Mexico. They come in from different places in Asia. I'm amazed at the many questions that are asked regarding training, breeding, and genetics, all of which could never be answered in just one conversation. I will accordingly deal with color laws and sex lineage and line breeding and thoroughbred racehorse pedigrees if you would like, no sweat. Please do, Mr. Heisman. I'd be very interested. Some 20 or so years ago, a prominent fancier visited my loft, and he wanted 5 Sions hens, all squeakers, that could be settled. I told him this would be an easy matter if he left the selection to me. I then proceeded to select blue bars and blue checkers, all of which were bred from either red or silver hens. He was astonished when I told him the sex was guaranteed 100% accurate, so I fully explained this sex linkage law to him, showing the mother of each of these 5 birds were red or silvers on their pedigrees. Many of the other visitors were given the information, so to save time explaining it to them, I prepared a small sheet which is now given to all visitors, and it is as follows. If you made it to a blue bar, you will only get blue bars of both sex. You may get a white flight or something, but you'll get strictly blue bars. If you made a blue check cock and a red check hen together, they will produce blue bars and blue checks and black checks, all of which have to be hens. And all the reds and silvers from that mating will always be cocks. If you made a blue check cock to a silver hen, they will produce red and silver cocks. All blues and blue checkers and black checkers will always be hens. A blue bar cock and a silver hen will produce blue bars and silvers. All the blue bars will be hens and all the silvers will be cocks. This is always true. 2 reds mated together can produce both hens and cocks of their own red coloring. But if they raise any blues or blue checkers or blacks or black checks, they will always be hens. I wanted to make a note here. All red and silver color birds having black ticks, or as I've seen such in them, black splashes or whatever, black, mixed onto the red in one way or another. Into the tail feathers, black splashes are always cocks. That's what I want to say. And hens that carry a little brown in their tail, you'll see that sometimes. It has to be a tan color or brown, definitely in their tail feathers, but not black. Those will be hens. Over the years since Mr. Heisman's death, I have had a great many fanciers remark that all of Mr. Heisman's Sions should have black ticking or be black splash. That they continue, in fact, is a trademark of the famous Heisman pigeons. Normally I allow such remarks to pass, but now for my reader, for my audience, not my reader, but for you all listening to me talk today, telling my first of my stories, I want to tell you that that's not always true whatsoever. In fact, today, now that I've pretty much run the Heisman Sions show, I can tell you that it's generally not true. Normally, I will explain why many of the Heisman Sions cocks did at one time carry so much black ticking, and why some never did, and why the few birds which now do honestly exist to this day, which are often found with little or no black ticking whatsoever. It is primarily because with the selection which Mr. Heisman often made when mating 2 of his pigeons together. So many times he bred a red gene cockbird or a male to a black gene female, or vice versa. Mr. Heisman did this over and over and over again for over half a century. Why did he do it? Because he believed it would produce a strong feathered pigeon, and mainly because he knew by mating as he was doing, he could definitely sex the babies from such nest, thus being able to guarantee to his potential buyers the exact sex of a young bird as they so desired. Mr. Heisman was not a person who wanted to receive feedback from anyone, from some disgruntled buyer who would eventually told him that he had sent him 2 males or 2 hens when he had ordered a pair. This was not a good business. So Mr. Heisman bred as I described, not always, for certain, for he bred many pairs together in which both the male and the female were the same color. I saw this done with many of his silvers, but he also did it with all colors. What evolved out of all this, by continuously mating red gene back onto the black gene for 20 generations or 30 generations, he was mating colors in the process. Red and black, black and red, over and over. The end result did, in fact, have many of the silvers and reds owning a lot of black ticking in them, or black splashing. And in many of his black checks and blue checks, you can inspect a wing or sometimes see some red coloring in the flights. But certainly not all of the Heisman birds were this way. Many of the reds which were mated together over many years took on a clean red coloring with very little black ticking whatsoever. And in this, to some extent, is the actual reasoning of why some of the surviving reds and silver Heisman Sions to this day have that clean coloring. Many of my birds that I breed are clean because I do mate a lot of silvers to silvers, and I mate a lot of reds to reds, and I've been doing it now for many generations. I will get recessive reds cropping back up. I do get some reds that have black in them, the cocks, but not many. But generally, if you're going to, I've explained why I'm not mixing the colors so much anymore. Let me try to. Many of the reds were mated together over many years, and they turned out to be clean reds, like I said. And coloring, they didn't have very much black ticking in them. And this, to some extent, is the actual reasoning why some of these surviving reds and silvers to this day are clean. Mr. Heisman did, in fact, once import one red cock from Robert Sion. And Robert was, Paul's son, and he did this after World War II, which was heavily splashed in black color. I mean, that bird almost looked like a grizzle pattern. It had black all over it, but it was a red chick. This particular bird's lineage spread throughout parts of the Heisman colony, and some of the birds down from this lineage were almost grizzle-like pattern, mixed with red and black coloring. Heisman noted to me, generally speaking, he had observed that the older a red male with black ticking aged, the more that black coloration spread with each successive molting, like a man slowly growing older and accumulating more gray hair as he got older. These red and silver males, Sions, slowly grow in more black from one year to the next. And he showed me pictures of birds when they were taken a year old, and then when they were 10 years old, and I could see, he was telling, he knew what he was talking about. You could see it. And while I am now on that subject of Mr. Heisman's pigeon colors, I must emphasize, not once did Mr. Heisman ever breed a solid black, I'm talking about black velvets, or a solid black, just want to say those pure black velvets. They don't exist in the Sions, or they didn't with him. This was also true of grizzles. And grizzle is a color pattern. You have to have a grizzle somewheres in the background to breed a grizzle. And I've never seen a true Sion grizzle. Anybody says he's got 100% true pure Sion grizzles, I put a question mark on that. And only twice did he ever breed a solid white pigeon. Both times those solid whites had dark eyes, and they were bred from Sions, and they were red. Both of the parents were red chicks, and both times the whites they were females. Mr. Heisman described them as true albinos. Mr. Heisman did breed chocolate-colored pigeons, which were always from different Stasser bloodlines. And on rare occasions, he bred some very dark, dullish-colored blue bars, which could have been classified as slate-colored. These came from both Sions and Stassers. And as for a lace pattern, I noted this on rare occasions in both black checks and blue checks. But generally speaking, Mr. Heisman rarely had a pigeon in his colony which was of a lace pattern. It was always hard to pick out which of these colors in Mr. Heisman's colony that attracted me most. But I fell in love with so many of them, and at times all of them. But certainly I saw so many magnificent blue bars, oh my goodness, as to keep anyone dazzled. And here and there I would sometimes spot one of his powder silver bar or Sions with those dark eyes, and certainly it was the same as if looking upon a diamond. Mr. Heisman, I asked, what about the line breeding? How do you feel about it? This is just another form of inbreeding, no sweat, which will enable one to keep a family rather closely related to some ancestor of great racing quality in my loft. I have mated father to granddaughter. Also, I made half sisters to half brothers with great results. In rare occasions, I have mated son to mother, but only for reproduction purposes, keeping the blood tight, keeping it close. Dealing with half brother and half sister matings, I am always line breeding toward a particular winner in which to get this blood in my colony. The method is simple. If it is a cock, I will mate him back to my very best hen, providing she is not too closely related to him, to get around to babies. Then I separate the pair and mate this cock to my second best hen for a pair of youngsters, assuming that the two matings produce a hen from one pair and a cock from the other. The following year, they should be mated together, and your selected pair, bred from the half-sister and brother, will have their grandsire, your best cock on both the father's and mother's side. This is line breeding. Many of the hens selected for one such mating could be a cross which brings in 1/4 new blood in the second generation. Many outstanding racers, as well as stock birds, have been the result of such matings. I well remember in the early 1920s, the late J.W. Logan won the San Sebastian Grand National with a famous red hen. Her band number was 1826, and that's what he called her, 1826. She was 8th the previous year and sold at Logan's final sale for $1,086 when the English pound was at its highest. She was bred from a half-brother and sister. Von Stassert's famous imposture, Belge, won second Paul National 600 miles over 3,000 birds competing. He was the result of a half-brother mating line bred as to the famous stock hen, blue check hen. If I mentioned the two owns birds Stassert called head-to-head as line bred to my famous headwind, it being the grandsire on both sides. My good Sion hen, a red check, was line bred to one of my Sion cocks, Sion Lou, on both father and mother side. He's talking about 64-029, the red check cock. In line breeding or inbreeding, it must be remembered that the bird selected must be sound in every way. And that's what I'm talking about earlier to you all, is that you can keep a family of birds. You have to know what a soundness is in a pigeon. You have to know what great health is in a pigeon. And that's what you've got to maintain that within a family. They have to be very, never have any sickness, never any deformities of webbed feet, crooked beaks, 11 flights in their wing. Any of those things, you've got to eliminate that. If that does crop up, you instantly get rid of that. You never let that go on inside of a family. We'll get back to it. It must be remembered that birds selected must be sound in every way, never with any defects, and in the best of health. If any weakness exists in either of the two birds, please bear in mind that in breeding closely we multiply the good as well as the bad characteristics. Many of the great racers have been produced by mating half-sister and brother using one of the birds from another well-tested strainer family. But I myself like to keep the family together. I have had great success in maintaining families. This form of line breeding is very popular in Belgium. What about racehorse breeding? Has the racehorse breeding influenced you in any way, Charlie? Being a Kentuckian, a Kentucky colonel, it has been my great and good fortune to meet and discuss the breeding of racehorses with many noted thoroughbred breeders. So I want to pass on to you, no sweat, my observations. In 1956, I had the pleasure of a visit from Mr. and Mrs. Rex Ellsworth of Chino, California. They bred Swaps, the great Kentucky Derby winner. Candy Spots, a half-brother to Swaps, and Tirong, also a great winner. Mrs. Ellsworth called for an appointment to see my racers because their 14-year-old son had a small loft in California. They knew very little about pigeon racing, but they had made millions of dollars with their Ellsworth Ranch of thoroughbred racehorses. I presented them with several of my young birds, including a daughter of Hurry Home, which flew 504 miles from me 7 times. The young boy wrote and thanked me. During the afternoon visit to my home, library, and loft, Miss Ellsworth asked if my racing homers were pedigreed, to which I replied, just as much as your horses are. When we proceeded to my pigeon loft library, he was amazed at my pigeon pedigree records. He was shown pedigrees of most of my winners going back 10 generations, and some of my birds are actually my own strain in that they have 125 to 250 ancestors in their pedigrees that were all bred by me in the Heisman lofts. My extended pedigree blanks are of my own design, and he was given a few dozen of those so that they could further trace back the ancestors of his own horses, because a racehorse pedigree shows only 4 generations. He could see at a glance the amount of inbreeding that took place by pedigrees. A question that I asked him was this: how much inbreeding do you resort to in racehorse breeding? And he replied, very little. I try to avoid close inbreeding, he said. My greatest stallion was Cowhead, the sire of swaps, and my Kentucky Derby winner, and 48 other United States stakes winners. A year or so later, another man visited who said, the large yearbook entitled American Racing Horses, which gives a review of the breeding and performance of outstanding thoroughbreds of that year. He supplied me with 3 years of books covering the winners from 1941, 44, and 47. Here I found 4 generation pedigrees of every stakes winner, and after a careful recap of 112 horses listed for the 3 years, only 15 had the same ancestors, showing twice in a 4-generation pedigree. This certainly confirmed Mr. Ellsworth's earlier answer to my question concerning inbreeding. This is quite a different from most of the racing pigeon pedigrees that I can produce, because we all practice some inbreeding and live breeding after producing a pair of birds that performed winners. Since this year's and Mr. Heisman's death, I wanted to say I have continued to study pedigrees of racehorses. They've always fascinated me as well, because I go to the racetrack and like to bet on horses, and I paid great attention to pedigrees. And there has been a tendency over the last 10 years for the horses, if you go back 2, 3, and 4 generations on, you'll start to see that there is much more line breeding now going on with racehorses than there used to be. I'll see several horses pop up of the same name, 3rd generation back, and you'll see some horses that weren't famous as breeders initially with the first generations out of them, but come back up, like for example for Secretariat. He wasn't known as a great breeding horse. Horses coming out of him that raced well in the first generation, but now you'll see him pop up 2 or 3 times on a pedigree or 3rd or 4th generation back, but not always him in particular. I'm many other horses, Aladar, and oh my God, so many. Charles Heitzman's first loft started when he was able to locate a large old wooden crate that he customized into a racing loft. It was 3 foot by 6 foot deep and 4 foot by 6 foot high. By 1912, he had developed his first race team, which consisted of 8 pigeons. In that year, Charles was the youngest person ever to join the Louisville Racing Pigeon Club. He won the first race on the 200. He sent 8 pigeons, and he got all 8 back in good race time. After the armistice in 1919, that's the end of World War I, Mr. Heisman imported a pair of pigeons, which he paid $150 for, from Mr. J.W. Toft in Liverpool, England. They were bred in 1919 and produced outstanding racers. Among the birds was the winner of the 1926 500-mile Buffalo, New York Championship race of Dr. L. Rue. It was before and during this period of time Mr. Heisman met Agnes Heimbrock. And on that January 21st, 1920, they were married at the Holy Trinity Catholic Church in Louisville, Kentucky, by Reverend Beersheim. This devoted couple eventually had 4 children, 1 son, Charles Jr., and 3 daughters, Mary Agnes. She and her husband eventually purchased the bakery in 1959. Today there are still 4 locations in operation of the famous Heisman Bakery. Maybe more, I may be wrong on this now, but in Indiana, but I believe that to be correct. Bernice Modesta, Aunt B, they called her, His daughter, who lived with him during his later years and was a good friend of mine, and Dorothy May. Mr. Heisman's father was Jacob Heitzman. He was born in July 27th, 1861, and in Heischock, Germany. I may be pronouncing the city wrong. He came to America in 1883, and he died on January 19th, 1956. He is the person in Heisman's family who started the bakery in Louisville in 1891. Mr. Heisman's other grandfather was Frank Heimbrock. He was born in Germany on November 8th, 1868, and died on December 27th, 1933. Mr. Heisman's son spent much time around the birds and grew very well in understanding them, even eventually being assigned with the racing pigeons in the Signal Corps during World War II, meeting Winston Churchill's daughter, Sarah, who Winston Churchill put so much faith into and confidence and loved. And she knew he was the person she confided into all throughout the war. Charles Jr. never wanted to have a life after World War II, much devoted to racing pigeons, and after that war, he eventually gave up all interest in them. In 1921, the first 1,000-mile long-distance event was accomplished by a pigeon by Charles Heitzman and flown by C.P. Bills, who obtained the pigeon for Mr. Heisman as a gift. This created a new record in the annals of long-distance racing for Louisville, Kentucky. Never before had this distance been accomplished, although many good birds went down trying to fly this stretch from Pearsall, Texas, back to Louisville, Kentucky. In 1922, Mr. Heisman imported a number of racing pigeons of the Logan strain, and this strain worked splendidly for him as well as for fanciers over the entire country. In 1924, another long-distance record was made by Mr. Heisman's Logan Blue Check Cock 2236, which was named All Alone. This racer put on an outstanding performance, flying 500 miles on the second day, single tossed, flying from Vicksburg, Mississippi back to Louisville in August, the hottest month of the year. All Alone went on to breed 5 young birds the following year that all went 300 miles on the day of the toss as young birds. In 1924, Heisman commissioned a London, England fancier to attend John Logan's retirement sale, and he bought a pair of birds for $720, the cock being number 575, a red, and the only son out of J.W. Logan's hen, 1836, which was sold for a world record price at that time of $1,080. The other bird bought at Logan's sale was 222, a black checker hen, on sister 269, at the San Sebastian 640-mile champion that sold for $760. I made a note here. John Logan Esquire died on May 25th, 1925, when he was 80 years old. A truly great champion long-distance racing pigeon flyer named F.W. Marriott. You know, you older guys that keep up with the history of racing pigeons, you all remember who F.W. Marriott was. Esquire, who lived in England, Birmingham, England, during this time was earning fame as being the best long-distance racing pigeon fancier in the entire world. And because of this, Mr. Heisman had to own some of his blood. The Marriott strain was recognized as one of the finest and oldest strains in the United Kingdom, a strain which had been setting long-distance records for nearly 3 decades. Mr. Marriott raced from a small loft and yet won more classic races than any other 2 top England champions combined. He won the San Sebastian 633 miles 2 years in succession against the entire country of England. And on top of this, he won Second Sebastian 633 miles in 1929, losing first place by 7 yards a minute. He was the premier prize winner, pulling down $800 and 4 cups, all of this competing with only 1 pigeon, competing against 2,000 other birds. By 1930, Charles Heitzman was sending out his 12-page booklets all over the world, which was the Marriott's mating list. And on the front page of his sales booklet, Mr. Heisman stated the following: "After deciding to introduce the Marriott strain, I have determined to have at least 1 bird each directly from each of Mr. Marriott's greatest champions. This necessitated the importing of 17 pigeons, the very cream of the Marriott strain. 1 pair of youngsters from each of these 13 pair of Marriotts being preserved for my own young bird team. These 13 pairs of Marriotts will breed more youngsters than required for my young bird team. Therefore, I take the means of offering to the American fanciers a limited number of my April, May, June, and July hatches. My high regard for this great English strain also compliance with the many requests for a 1930 Marriott mating list prompted the issuance of this one. It will also benefit the readers of the Marriott reference book who may be desirous of introducing a pair of 2 pure Marriotts into their loft. You have here a rare English strain with 25 years of careful breeding and racing behind it. And Charles Darwin tells us, like produces like. Surely the Marriotts, which have been line breeding to champion after champion, are more than qualified to produce winners. All throughout this period of time, Mr. Heisman was seeking the finest long-distance racing pigeons in the world. For several years, he had been following the long-distance records of a man in France called Paul Sions. Mr. Heisman's initial information, which was first came to him regarding Paul Sions, came by way of F.W. Marriott, who highly regarded Paul Sions' abilities with long-distance racing pigeons. The more Mr. Heisman began to read about Paul Sions, and see the pictures of his pigeons, the more Mr. Heisman began to fall in love with the Sions. Now then, before I proceed any further with this story, allow me to say yes, I am well versed and aware that there are many different Sions fanciers throughout the United States who have their own stories to tell about Sions. And granted, many of these stories deserve attention. Amen. I must pause here to mention a fine friend I once admired who is now deceased. He was a great Sions enthusiast, which I was able to happily live with on 3 different occasions, and only because of my lifelong friend Gary Stone, a great racing pigeon flyer who now lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, who so generously financed our Sions trips. This man I am speaking of was a physical giant of a man, but a wonderfully friendly, was wonderful to me, the poor and no sweat. Appropriately enough, he was a pro football player who lived in California, and his name was Mr. John M. Garzoli. John believed from the early importations of the old original Paul Sions beginning in 1925 all the way up until their last importations in 1946, they were the finest long-distance racing pigeons that had ever been in the world. Of the over 150 birds that were imported from Paul Sions to America, John believed that Leroy, 22 France 153233 blue bar white flight cock, was by far the best of all the Sions that ever came into North America. John told me, no sweat, the finest birds which Paul Sions sent over here are the ones related to his bird named Rouge Macot. I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. It's Ruge Macot. Some of the finest Paul Sions went to Ferdinand's in Cuba, and John McAfee with another Sions flyer. I made a note, but John McAfee is another one of Charles Heitzman's excellent racing associates and good friends, which was famous for crossing Sions and Stasses and dominated long-distance racing. He was able to get some of those when I talk about Leroy as being the number one Sions, because I am including Leroy's progeny, the Falconess, another great Sions, his granddaughter, and the great 1104, his son. Right now, there are more Sions champions that I go back onto these 2 than any I know. Why was Leroy such a great breeder? Well, I think it went back onto the fact that Paul Sions started his strain based on the Weg strain, or the Weggies, and with 1 or 2 important crosses, namely the Gris Dugnol Mir, again, it's a French name, but I'm mispronouncing, and a red male from the Deltower. By crossing the Weggie male and the Weggie hens, which was a granddaughter of this French bird, this Rouge Vicman, he obtained a blue bar hen with black eyes. And when this hen was paired back with the product of the Weg cross, she bred him a red Sions with black eyes. And when this hen was paired back to the product, to the gray hen of 1910, when this hen was paired back to a product of the Vicum Gris line, the gray hen of 1910 was produced. It was this hen that really founded the strain of Sions. It was this hen from whom Leroy is closely descended. In fact, I believe the closest that Paul Sion ever sent to this country, the old gray hen's line, and became of this the American fancy, and in particular L.F. Curtis, was getting the best that Paul Sion ever sold. I have spoken with many of the top European flyers such as Pat DeWeerd and Tom Buck and others, and they all tell me that the best Sions are in America, not in Europe, and that the war had a lot to do with this. And by the best, they are speaking about the Grizz Sions, which are few and far between in Europe. And one reason the best Sions wound up here is simply because Americans were willing to pay more for them than were the fanciers in Europe. Heisman was one of the top Sion lofts ever, and a big reason is because he had bloodline down from Luke Curtis, which was down from the gray hen. But I believe Mr. Heisman fell short of really getting use out of his family of birds, because in 1943 he sold most of those birds. He saved 45818 male and female Grizz, which he kept. The great 833294 was one of those sold, herself a great racer and a granddaughter of Rouge Macot. Mr. Giovanni had grandson to that hen, which was the greatest racer he ever had, called Truckee King, which won 1964 first on the 500-day combine and third on the day on another 600-mile combine 2 weeks later. Curtis told me one of the interesting things about his imported Paul Sion pigeons is that many of them are big and raw bone, and that in itself is not what most American fanciers desire. But when I cross them back into the old Grizz family of Sions, he said the result is a small, compact bird, which Americans love. John's opinions were of that, but I have to absolutely disagree with his assessment of Mr. Heisman's handling of Leroy bloodlines. Mr. Heisman was acutely aware of his superior homing instincts being passed down through the Leroy blood. Now then, I'll continue. How do I go about giving you the complete story of Charles Heitzman? I mean, I'm going on now. I'm talking about it, and that of Paul and Robert Sion. How do I, as a small boy from Kentucky, ever find himself buying racing pigeons from the world's finest racing pigeon flyer, and in the doing entwine half a century or more of his life, perpetuating them all over the world? I will attempt to give you this story through Charles Heisman's own words, for he alone should know best. It is true that Luke Curtis imported many fine Sions, as did many other prominent fanciers in the United States, but no other fancier ever came as close in making Sions as widespread and as popular as did Charles Heitzman. Of all the many different strains of pigeons he bought, flew, and sold, it was his beautiful Sions, so often known for their reds and silvers, which turned out to be his bread and butter. As I sat in his library, he handed me a notebook and told me to start writing. My colony today, he said, comprises primarily of two strains, the Sions and the Stassers, each a strain deriving its name from the original founders. For now, I will deal with only the Sions, a strain founded by Mons Paul Sion of Lille, France, and his birds were a class act. There has never been anything as nice as the Sions. It was in the winter of 1930 that I was first introduced to my Sions. My first Sion was a dark check cock. I'm opting out to give you all these band numbers not to bore you all. Bred from an original pair sent to F. Marriott by Mons Paul Sion in 1926. I then imported at great cost 4 direct Sions of sterling quality, and they were as follows. It was a blue check white flat cock, a blue check white flat cock, a red hen, and a black check hen. Those were the first 4 birds, Sions, that Charles Heitzman imported into the United States. All 4 of these pigeons were bred and flown by Mons Paul Sion of France. Only one of the 4 failed as a great producer in my loft. The other 3 bred great birds, the blood of which is still winning for me today. In 1931, Luke Curtis sent me 2 wonderful Sions from his very best blood, and these birds were a red cock from Leroy and a blue bar cock with 1 white flight from Lorraine, a silver hen as a mate. He goes on talking about this pair made history in my loft in many parts of the United States, England, Canada, Japan, China, and so many other countries. I later named them Pair H. In 1912, This pair produced her heir first year breeding. I'm going to slow down right here on reading all this detailed information. I'm not sure it's going to bore you or you can keep up with it. But it's how he went about mating certain birds back to certain birds, and the initial stages of breeding his Sions. The roots of the Sions. To the above were added 4 other splendid Sions that he got from Ferdinand's in Cuba, and I've got pictures of Heitzman when he visited Cuba. He got the birds from a guy down there named Ferdinand's in Cuba, because this guy was a wealthy man and had bought the very best birds out of Sions and Stassers. Notably, a blue check cock that he got from Paul Sion, and a blue bar, imported Sion pair, silver cock. It goes on. He got these birds after the death of Henry Beach. And some of you older guys in your 70s and 80s, you all might remember Henry Beach, if you kept up with the history of racing pigeons. He said, after the death of Henry Beach in 1935, I selected through the executor of his estate my good Sion hen, 962, a blue check pied hen. She was selected as my only choice from the entire sales list because of her performances as a yearling in winning the 514-mile race. She proceeded to be the best investment I ever made on a Sion, although I paid enormous sums for many of the original Sions. The hen 962 only cost me $10, and she produced 6 500-mile day birds and 11 winners in 4 years. Her 4 grandparents were all bred by Lou Curtis, directly down from his Siena importations. A daughter of 962 became my great breeder of all that line called the Glory family. In 1938, Mr. Earl Mortimer mated a Curtis Sion cock, a blue bar cock named Leroy, with my blue check hen, who was out of 1104 and 1033, and from this mating were bred several outstanding birds. All of these birds were blue bar pencil in color and have left many great birds in my loft with dark colored eyes. I must not forget Dr. Mortimer's famous hen, Sylvia 208, which was first on the 625-mile concourse and a winner many times. Her mother was a son of Leroy and Sylvia, and was mated to my good hen, a red check cock, 1104 and 1033, and again this blood scored in the long races. Another good bird, another red check cock, goes on and on. At Paul Sion's sale in 1939, I bought a red check cock and a red check hen, another red check cock, and another red check hen, and these 4 birds turned out to be truly great breeding long-distance stock. The last original Paul Sion's introduced was my French Sion pair, France 38, and gives the band numbers. A red check cock in France, another silver bar hen, great daughter of Rouge Macad, or however you pronounce that. In 1945, I exchanged a Stassert for a Sion with Dr. Louis Perez, and a blue bar hen he sent was mated to the son of Morning Glory. The result of this mating was my champion, His Glory, which won first on a 500-mile day of toss, was on the wing almost 15 hours, 14 hours and 27 minutes on the wing to clock in. This was the base of the Paul Sions used in producing the present-day Sions, which I now own. These Sions are long-distance birds, truly great long-distance and beautiful birds. And they are great reproducers. Keeping them in a tight family and keeping this blood, this genetic family together is very important. None of this has come about by accident. Just to cite a few performances of the old pair of 1104 and 1033, that's Heisman's original Sion pair, bred a pair of red check cocks in the first nest 1931 that both proved to be great racers as well as stock birds. Second 2 hens were a dark check hen and another dark check hen, a dark red check hen and a dark check hen, and they became great breeders. It goes a long list of all the things that came down out of that original pair of his Sions, which I will tell everyone that the red checks that I have now are down out of that, out of that blood, that 1104 and 1033, which is the Leroy blood. Once you start to understand the pedigrees of all this, the old red, and a lot of my blue bars go back onto that Leroy blood as well. The old Paul Sion hen was mated to this and that. Let's see. I'm trying to go down through here. I'm trying to keep this interesting for you. It gets very, when you start tracing each bird to that bird and going, it gets a little boring. It gets a little tedious. I may lose you. I don't want to lose you. I want to try to keep. I'm trying to give you the history of the Sions, detailed with Charles Heitzman. He says, I tried to avoid mating birds too closely in the beginning, but I did want to keep my family together. But I found some of the very key birds that I mentioned in every other branch of the line. I did make birds that were close together and did have great success with them. I doubt whether I could produce a great Sion winner without the blood of the Curtis pair, 1104 and 1033 appearing so many times back in my ancestry. In 1948, a nest pair of hens were produced. He goes on talking about what he did in 1948, he said, I actually bred 30, he goes on to, I'm going on to something else now. I actually bred 36 of her ancestors, and there are 40 birds in a pedigree that passed through my hands and Mr. Lou Curtis. This is conclusive proof that our best birds, so why not take those bred down from the best long-distance racers? A very dear friend of mine on the West Coast recently told me he rarely breeds from his old bird racers and yearlings. I told him his best words were on his race team. They are the results of survival of the fittest, so why not take the first round of youngsters and let this compare to the young bird race team? The direct offspring of one's racers will make much better racers than those bred from prisoners with long pedigrees and fashionable strains. And I believe strongly in that. I know there's people in the United States right now that they're selling Sions that say, oh, this bird's down out of 40 years ago it did this, its great grandparents did this, or even 20 years ago it did. They might as well have chickens in the loft. Those birds are just pets. You've got to be breeding out of pigeons today that are flying out of pigeons that were racing today, if you want good pigeons, if you want to race pigeons. In breeding from racing stock, the feeding of squeakers must be transferred to the feeders, because of the burden of feeding will prove quite detrimental to racers. In my early days, during the period from 1912 to 1925, I had the good fortune to meet and visit the late Mr. Charles Ellsworth of Cincinnati, Ohio. And again, I want to stop here. Charles Ellsworth and Charlie Heisman were extremely good friends. They both highly respected each other. This man was a wonderful rider, breeder, and flyer of long-distance racers who served as the president of the International Federation and the president of the American Racing Pigeon Union. His loft was an example never to be forgotten. He raced only 8 pairs of old birds in a small loft. He would rear a dozen nice youngsters in March, and this would constitute his young bird team. Bred from the racers, his loft was the last word in perfection. It had running water, perfect ventilation, and was always perfectly clean. His ambition was to perfect a strain in which all the birds for 6 generations, every bird in that 6th generation, were all 500-mile day birds. He achieved his ambition to the extent of 4 and 5 generations straight, with every bird in there being 500-mile day birds. Before his death in 1931, he created a family of 500-mile day birds, but it took him his entire life. More of the younger people now getting into our sport should follow Mr. Ellsworth's example by possessing fewer and better birds and keeping their families pure and straight and knowing what to look for within a family. And not spending money on hybrids and crossing pigeons and flipping coins and willy-nilly. Your overall expenses are also considerably less if you follow this. Mr. Heisman, I asked, what happened to the Sions during World War II, and what was your relationship to Paul Sion's son, Robert, after that war? Mr. Heisman paused. No sweat? Not many fanciers ever asked those questions. As you know, France declared war on Germany in September 3, 1939, following the German invasion of Poland on September 1st. The German invasion was called the Blitzkrieg. Paul Sion actually lived on the northern border of France, which was not a good place to be living during this time. The Germans knew all too well about pigeons being able to carry messages. In fact, during the Battle of France, Sions' home was besieged by German forces for several days, and those French citizens who lived in the north and western areas of France fled to the south and east. That eventually became known as the Vichy France, and was the region of the country where most of the French resistance was kept. Themselves there they hid. The Germans issued a proclamation stating, anyone in France in possession of a racing pigeon is subject to face execution for spying. I have a letter from his son here. I want you to read it. No other person besides myself has ever seen it. I took the old and yellowed letter which Mr. Robert Sion had written to Mr. Heisman, and it read as follows. My parents used to live in Tourcoing, France in 1919. My father, having constructed a new pigeon house, gave me the old one, and I made my debut in breeding of carrier pigeons. I was 21 years old. 2 years later, at my marriage, I left my father's home to establish myself in Halun, near the family mills. The factory Halun, I may be pronouncing that word again, is a little city 10 kilometers, about 6 miles. 1 kilometer is 1,093 yards from Tourcoing in France. In 1922, I set up a new pigeon house there. 3 years later, I already carried away with great success and won the championship of the long distance contest with 15 prizes from 15 pigeons entered in the 600, 700, and 800 kilometer races. In 1930, before resounding success, the Carrier Pigeon Breeders Society of Tourcoing made the decision to reduce the zone radius of admission of amateurs in order to exclude me from the contest. That same year, it happened that I moved and returned to live at Tourcoing, 1 kilometer away from my father's home. The pigeons that were accustomed to this new pigeon house won the same year disproportionate successes. In the first contest, I had 3 firsts. In the second contest, 4 firsts with 9 pigeons, and in the third contest, 5 firsts. In 1931, 7 times I took down the first prize in contest as far as 500 kilometers, including the first prize in the international contest with Belgium over tours. Goes on and on with all the different things that Sion did. My father's pigeons was requisitioned by the French army and sent to the military pigeon houses in southern France to be reared and bred at the armistice in 1945. The pigeons were sent back to our disposal care. A selection composed of my father's 30 best pigeons and 30 best from my pigeon house were preserved in 1947. After the death of my father, I merged with the 2 pigeon houses until 1940. I had obtained the greatest success in the middle distances, my father specializing in long distances. Since the end of the war, I have exerted myself as well as to succeed in long distance contests. My list of honors of 1951, I am adding to the present note scene to prove that I have managed to do so. It seems to me that there is no way to end this short note than in quoting the passage from a letter of Dr. Bricot, the raiser and unequal champion of Belgian pigeon racing, a letter that I found in my own archives. The best pigeons, he said, that I have ever introduced into my colony are the pigeons of your fathers, those Sions that he bred, those magnificent Sions, and yours as well. I'll never again introduce any other pigeons. The Sions are the finest that ever existed. And the other passage from the letter he wrote to me June 8, 1928, I have entered 15 pigeons of which, June 8th, I have entered 15 pigeons of which 13 are 2-year-old in the national contest and as a result 13 prizes, 12 to the 40th and 150 prizes. Among these 13 2-year-olds, pigeons are 4 of yours. I turned the next page of the letter, and to my surprise, it was all written in French. I could not read French, and so I wished that I could. There was wonderful information in this letter. I just knew it, and it was written in French that intrigued me and teased me so much that I could decipher remarks about many of the racing pigeon men in the 1800s, and also notes about Monsieur Dugnoil, and Leroy. Resting in the letter in my lap, I looked back up at Mr. Heisman. You told me the history of our sport. You hold the history of our sport in your hands, I said. So much of so many people do not even begin to know. Mr. Heisman smiled. No sweat. My son was in the Signal Corps during World War II. My Sions were right there with him, not only in England but also in China, our allies against the Japanese in 1942. The Signal Corps issued a call to civilian pigeon fanciers for young, healthy birds of both genders. The Army offered a purchase of the birds for $5 each. I donated nearly 1,000 pigeons during the war. Often I was able to receive gas rationing stamps instead of money. The gas helped me in training my pigeons. I have several photographs of my son with Winston Churchill's daughter, if you would like to see. She is holding one of his racing pigeons with gloves. I laugh every time I see that photo. Who ever heard of anyone holding a pigeon with gloves? The Army developed a special cage and parachute for homing pigeons for aircraft to supply isolated troops with the means of communication. The device was also used to drop thousands of pigeons, 16,500 pigeons to be exact, over the countryside of France during June 1944 because of the Normandy invasion. French civilians were to send back information about it, all they knew regarding German troop movements. Over 2,000 of these birds returned back to England with the questionnaires answered. The German intelligence found that about these pigeons and were able to sabotage some of them with bogus messages which came back to England. And there were also trained German snipers stationed along the coast called hawk units who shot any pigeon they spotted. How many of these Sions were in action, we will never know, but they were certainly there. And this is another one of my notes. I have written several fictional short stories for the Racing Pigeon Digest and almost so many other magazines that have been existing in the United States since the 1940s that involve Sion. And of one note I wanted to make here, some can now be found on my website, the Heisman Sions, if you want to read some of those stories. But one note I want to make. Just a couple of years ago, a family in England, while cleaning out their old chimney, found the skeleton of a homing pigeon, and attached to its leg was still the original World War II message holder, and also the original message in code which that bird had been carrying from France. This making national news, and today still the message has not been able to be deciphered. Throughout my friendship with Charles Heitzman, which lasted from 1959 to about 1987, close to 30 years there, he sent me 650 beautifully handwritten letters while creating this article. So you can see we kept up a real steady correspondence. While creating this article for Mr. Sions, the editor of the Racing Pigeon Diet, it occurred that I should condense some of these letters and offer my reader a glimpse of my Mr. Heitzman, not only in pigeons, which were intertwined with all he did, but also in his life. When we speak at length about anyone, we know in pigeons we eventually converse about who that person is beyond those pigeons. In this, we get a feeling of somehow fully knowing the person. I hope doing this, I have somehow made Charles Heisman once again come back to life, and now you can sit back and almost listen to him speak. I have many interests and pursuits in life, as anyone who really knows me, and they would not agree. And one of my interests has always been in letters. I have owned and sold many letters, and having been written by Abraham Lincoln and Ernest Hemingway, Cassius Clay, and others. My next book, which will likely appear soon, is Letters from a Genius to an Oaf, and then this book is based on the correspondence between Guy Davenport and my old writing mentor and myself. Letters are always interesting, as sometimes they tell us far more about a person than they would ever state themselves. I have grafted exact quotes from various Charles Heitzman letters and now present them to you. Here's one of them. This is just a little piece of the letter that Heisman sent to me, one of them. You might almost say that I train winged athletes. A homing pigeon, which can fly back to your loft over a distance of 300 miles, is a good bird. But when you strive to rear a bird which will be able to fly 12 or 14 hours on a stretch, staying on the wing, always aloft, and that covers over 500 and 600 miles, then that bird must be handled as carefully as men enter the great athletic contest. Truly, you have a diamond in your hands then. Here's another letter. Yes, there must be care in the feeding of these fast-flying birds, and that care must start as soon as the squab is out of the eggshell and ready for its meal. For the first 8 days of the little naked bird's life, it is giving nothing but abundance of perfect pigeon milk. I thought, of course, you know pigeons don't feed their young, and most of the other birds do. It isn't the kind of milk that the higher animals give their young, but it's the secretion of the membrane of the crop. Pigeon milk is slightly yellow and about like cream cheese in consistency. The old bird pushes his bill down the throat of the squab, and his parent bird pumps and the baby sucks. I suppose that's the reason old Shakespeare said something about somebody being as gentle as a sucking dove in one of his plays. Then when the squab gets its 7 days' ration of its unusual food, the old birds stop their secretion. At the time, they fill their crops with the ordinary pigeon food, like grains and seeds, plus abundance of water. When this mass has become soft enough for the delicate digestive system and the organs of the growing young pigeon, it is given to the squab by its parents. Yes, both of the old birds help in rearing of the young. Even the cockbird secretes the pigeon milk, as does the other bird. When the squab is 8 days old, where the fancier has to look out for the old bird's choice food, that the young may grow properly. I suppose that every day a person has an ideal we feed pigeon grain. We do. About 1/4 of the food is either corn or wheat or a mixture of both. To this we add 75% Canadian peas, vetch seeds, and tick beans. These later seeds are legumes. In other words, they are rich in proteins like the beans and peas which come out on our table. Which I am trying to explain is that wheat and corn for a homing pigeon are the same as potatoes and bread for us. No one can produce an athlete on such starchy diet, can they? And don't fail to remember, when a squab is 28 days old, it is about as big as it'll ever be, and otherwise quite well developed. So during that short period, the fancier has to care and feed for the properly, or it will never be a fine showboard or an outstanding racer. Even with all the attention which an expert fancier can give his squabs, a great many of them are not good enough to be kept. I should have told you, too, that improper food or even poorly balanced ration in our pigeon lofts will open up to many diseases. We build a good bird with its food. At the same time, we build a resistance to disease, that it may help and well be a good racer. I sometimes think that those of us who are developing birds with fine bones, strong muscles, and perfect feathers for flying don't use nearly so much care in what our own children eat. There's another quote from Charles Heitzman in a letter that he sent to me. This article you wrote needs a few corrections. I am not a kid at 76, so please, from now on, when you refer to me, use Colonel Heitzman. Thank you. Here's another one. No sweat. Do not write anyone of my ailment. Mr. John Roberts, he was an editor of the Racing Pigeon Digest. No, not Racing Pigeon Digest, but Racing Pigeon Bulletin. He was a friend of mine. He said, do not write to anyone of my ailment. John Roberts puts in his magazine last fall when Miss Heisman was sick. We received several hundred get well cards and were acknowledged by over 100 of them. I spent $5 and put in a thank you note in the bulletin rather than continue sending letters of thanks. I hope that your article that has to do with, here's another letter from Heisman. I hope that your article that has to do with yours truly, that the readers knows that who Charlie actually is. With a man that has spent his entire life with one breed of racing pigeons, he should be referred to at least as Heitzman. There are thousands of Charlies, but few Heitzmans in the world. Thank you, Charlie. Here's another one. Oh yes, I sold High Pockets to a Canadian. I have some good offspring from him. He fetched a very good price, or he would never have left my loft. The next time you come to see me, you will also have a dinner with Miss Heitzman. She will be 79 on January 21st, our 54th anniversary. She had a heart attack in November. I ordered 100 pounds of long grain rice from our wholesale grocery, and it cost me $46.36 for 100 pounds. Wow! Inflation is here. If Nixon lasts through 74, we will have trouble in the USA. The working man cannot exist and accept such government as he is trying to make us believe. A hearty state of affairs. I wish that I could impeach him or somehow get him out of the driver's seat. Here's another letter that Heisman sent to me. Did you see the September 24th, 1973 Racing Pigeon Bulletin where the big All-American Award for both bird and young bird went to Charles Seeger and his wife? They fly nothing but my Sions. And in these 9 old bird races, you'll see that they won over, going against close to 19,000 birds in one race, 23,000 birds in another. That is real competition. I'm enclosing a sheet of my 500, 600, 700 mile winners with my stock, which I trust you will study. Here's another one. Heisman writes to me, says, our son and his family will be here for Christmas. The first time he has been here for Christmas since 1950. Here's another one. My dear friend, No Sweat, yours of March 1st was a surprise to us, and we hope that your injury will show improvement. You have always been such a dear and close friend of the Heisman family, as is Chestine. We will remember you in our prayers and our speedy recovery. Let me know if your birds were taken. Wishing you a speedy recovery. Your old friends, Charles Heitzman, age 88, and my daughter, Bernice, age 55. Our love to you and Chestine, always. Here's another one from Heitzman. I do not care to show birds at the National Show. I do not have any single compartment shipping crates just now. Just sent a wicker 6-bird basket to Canada. There's a wicker 4-bird crate and a Stassert sent to me in the 30s, and it will never be sold or given away. The Racing Pigeon Bulletin is not a weekly, as I understand it, until the new management gets all the details worked out. John Roberts deserves more credit than any of us could shower upon him. All the years, 29 plus, he published America's only weekly racing pigeon magazine. When you visit, try not to come until after 1 o'clock p.m. because my loft boy is attending college and I have so much to look after. I always look forward to seeing you, and I can't wait till you get here, and I hope you'll bring Chestine as well. Here's another one. Here's another letter. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday are not normally days for shipping pigeons for me. It has always best to visit me on another day. Or he says Monday and Tuesday is always when he ships pigeons. We have 2 great children and 2 more due in. We have 2 great grandchildren and 2 more due in March and September. This Heisman strain is really starting to be prolific. Here's another letter. He says pedigrees are enclosed. They are, as you can see, they're some of my very best Sions. We got 3 inches of snow on Saturday and a few sub-zero nights. Wow, can't wait till spring gets here. Then here's another letter he sent to me. The Red Cock 874 that you love so well is not for sale and never will be. He is one of my favorites. The Silver Cock, which you handled, is a 1970 hatch. He has a good body and a show head. Another of my very finest, best 1970 Sions. And he's not for sale either. I told you this when you were handling him. See the brief pedigree I have enclosed. I have always held you in the very highest regards, but I simply cannot sell these pigeons to anyone. If I could sell them to you, I would, as you are my dear friend, but I must keep them. I wish you great success with your new 38-foot by 12-foot 2-story loft on concrete piers. This must have cost you a fortune of money at today's prices, saying nothing of the labor and cost alone. I pay my loft man $3 an hour. He attends college 5 days a week after helping me 8:30 to 12, 7 to 8 hours on Saturdays and Sundays. There's another letter from Heisman. We returned from West Palm Beach on the 24th. Had a nice time for Miss Heisman. A wheelchair had to be used to get her from West Palm Beach plane to the Louisville, Kentucky plane in Atlanta. The same on our way to Florida. She is 78 and her traveling days are numbered. As for me, I can walk any distance within reason. Your pair of July squeakers out of High Pockets, Silver Splash Cock, and the Dark Red Hen are about 2.5 weeks old. One is a dark red check cock and the other is a red check white flight splash. Glad you're going to graduate school this fall. I am very proud of you as a good pigeon person, and more so as an outstanding person in general. You are a true Southern gentleman, and I admire you. A good education is priceless. Our son's youngest daughter is spending 2 months in Europe. She wrote me from England and Germany. Spent a week in Italy and Holland. She is attending Berry College in northern Miami, Florida. Only nuns are allowed there. Catholic nuns teach them. Here's another letter. I shipped 12 birds to Quebec, Canada yesterday and 20 to Japan last week. Here's another one. Thank you so much for the photo of my loft. John Muir, age 879. I will treasure this. The picture of him. I took a picture of him, his loft man, helping cleaning around the loft. He talks about some birds that he sold here. The hen I asked you about is a pencil blue hen, almost a blue checker. Her number is 4446. Bought her from Jim Saline's when he retired from the sport. I paid $600 for about 7 of his best concourse winners. They were all my blood, and I gave you the diploma. She is a pure Heisman. Do you have anything from her yet? My old loft man has been here. Is another letter from him. My old loft man has not been here since December 1st. I do it all myself with the aid of a high school lad. I sure need you up here to help. Please come and spend as much time here as possible. Your expertise is noted and desired. I tried to hire a part-time worker, but seems the one out here will work once Social Security money is available. We'll sell most of my birds in November and keep a few and discontinued selling so many. This has all become just too much work for an old man, and as you well know, I do not need the money. Here's another letter. Merry Christmas to you in Chestine. I want to give you a pair of 1971 birds. So if I get you in our vicinity somewhere in January 72, please stop by, but let me know exact dates so I will be home. All of our children and offspring will be there for Christmas. 16 are coming for the greatest birthday of all, the birthday of baby Jesus, over 1900 years ago. Calendar enclosed. Here's another letter from him. Give a pigeon at least 2 to 3 weeks rest before shipping to the 500 for the best results. The day I ship to a 500, I take the birds out to 30 miles very early and release them. I fly both cocks and hens at 500. I have found my hens fly best to eggs that are 12 days old. Some say remove the grit before a race, but I never do. It is best to fly at least 2 separate teams. Alternate the races the week to a week. Birds getting good rest are extremely important. I cannot emphasize birds getting long rest between preparing for a major race. It's so important. Here's another letter I got. I have no eggs to spare, Robbie. Just mated last week, and eggs are as valuable to me as they are to you. When you visit here, I will show you the diplomas I won. I have a lot of offspring and would want to keep all this data in my files. I do not really anxious to part with my offspring of the 1972 imported Red Sion male. He's getting up in years now since when his Miller's High Life beer called booze. I drink a bottle per day, and the liquor stores would starve if they depended on me for beer or whiskey. Only drink it as medicine if I have a cold when it comes to whiskey. Our anniversary, 1070, we bought a case of Old Granddad and a Fitzgerald, and still have 2 quarts left. Showing a pigeon films is a great way to promote the pigeon sport. There's another letter. The enclosed card is the most expensive I have ever sent out. It is my card to Fancier Friends in 1963. I found 14 of them and want you to have one. With the color pigeons on each, it costs 59 cents each. At today's cost of paper and union printers, it would be cost over $1 per copy. I've had many visitors, although do not advertise visitor days. Too many come as it is. My 6C feed is costing me over 16 cents a pound. I've bought a lot of whole corn at $5.75 for $5.75 for 100 pounds, and that brings down the cost a little. Your letters are always so interesting, so please write to me when you can find time. I love your letters. You are one of the most interesting people I have ever known. One of our small country papers, the Jefferson Reporter, had an article about my pigeons in my library last week. Received already over 600 Christmas cards from Fancier Friends, including from England, Africa, Nova Scotia, Japan, Formosa, Mexico, South America, and Puerto Rico. I try to return the compliment if they get their address, so you know I keep busy in the correspondence. Here's another letter. My birds had open loft today from 10:30 a.m. to sundown, and they conditioned themselves in addition to my tosses as mentioned. I always like to toss my birds the day of the club shipment because on the 500 they were in a crate or baskets for 2 to 3 days. This is also true of the 300. Glad to hear that the 500-mile trophy I donated that carries my name, and I know that you will win it, and again beat all those pigeon flyers in the Lexington Kentucky Racing Pigeon Club. They are no competition for you. I may have a squeaker from the old red imported Sions cock for sale in June. I get $30 per bird for his offspring. I have a lot of futurity bands from friends in various parts of the United States wanting me to ban birds for them. I still contend that you should take it easy with those yearlings. 500 miles is too much for yearlings when you are establishing an old bird team. You will drop many of your good birds past 300-mile race. The picture of the blue-white flat cock was taken by my photographer on September 3rd. It is not one you took of him, although you've taken so many beautiful pictures of my birds, and I so much appreciate it. I photographed 18 birds Sunday, and the proofs came in yesterday. They are the best that I have ever taken. I changed the background to off-white from jet black, and always feel free, Robbie, to ask me any questions. I'm so glad that you're interested. Another letter. Last week, fanciers from Milwaukee, Ohio, Illinois were here for 6 hours, and again, much mail and pedigrees were not taken care of that day. Here's another letter. Dear Earl and Chastine, or should I address you preferably so as Mr. and Mrs. Robbins, enjoyed your long letter as usual, and refer to your father's success and many good instructions. Even though a man is not a college graduate, if he works and plans intelligently and honestly, needs to be a well-educated person. I always told my 4 children, all of you must go through high school, and they did. Our youngest, Dorothy, mother of 4 children, had 2 years of college. The richest man in the USDA in my early life, 20s and 30s, was quite often referred to as the multimillionaire with only 1 year of elementary school. A dropout after 6th grade, he was Charles Schwab of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. He had foresight and a lot of imagination, plus a hard worker, and knew how to handle people. You know, education is a must in my book, but many high school pupils go through high school, but one high school does not go through them. Congratulations to you and Chastine on your marriage. We celebrated our 53rd anniversary at Louisville's Badlands Restaurant with a dinner for our 3 daughters and their families. We had a great celebration, many gifts and so forth. I hope your days and months and years are as happy as ours on the sea of matrimony. We were married 11 months, and along came Charles Jr., our only boy. He is now 52 years old and retired. Married life is empty shell without a child or 2. It is rather difficult to preach to a young couple to have children in this day and time, this day of the peel, but this great community, this great country of ours is doomed in less than a century unless our young population keeps increasing. If everything young couples vow they will not have any offspring, why should we build more schools and college buildings? He goes on to say some racist things here, but not in a bad way. I love Charlie. Let's see, he talks about here, it costs a lot to live in this day and time. I do not know how you do this. Please do not feel offended by this high epistle, but I mean all this because of my high regard for you, for both of you. It is very seldom that an old codger takes out the time to write as many pages as I do to you, this even being an 8-page letter. But you two are very close and so dear to me, and there is much sound advice in what has been written. I wish I could be a cricket and sit on top of the door jamb and watch you 2 kids scraping off the wallpaper in your new home and beautifying your home, your sweet home. Be honest and true to one another, and you will enjoy long years of happiness. Here's another letter he sent to me. I rarely let the young birds out with the old birds because they had separate traps to go through. As you know, 4 sets, see my Loft book, as the number of birds I raise each year, 500 to 600. Some years in 1971 it was less due to the late mating after my trip to the hospital. Headwind 531 was my greatest racer that ever left my loft as a breeder. The Gibbs Inman Packaging Company, 819 West Market Street in Louisville, printed many of my books. The Sions book was printed on Slater Printed Company, East Ormsby Street in Louisville. His time, 55052, son of Headwind, flew 504 miles 10 different times, 615 miles 3 times. This is the best record of any bird in my loft. Several of my hens have flown 500 miles 8 times. As for futurities, I am only entering a few this year, mostly those that bought a lot of my stock. I have frequently sent a pair of both cock and hen to a race together. Of course, all sex are separated in the shipping crates. So he knows nothing of her being in the flock. In 1947, Helen, a black-check hen, and her mate dropped on the loft together, a mated pair of yearlings. They came in at about 7:45 in the morning on the second day from 615 miles. This was very unusual. Eyesight has absolutely no value with racing pigeons. Period. No matter what anyone says or promotes. Eyesight has no value unless the bird has a strong back, long primaries, short secondaries, and is extremely healthy and bred from good stock. Common pigeons also have eyesight. I've seen many pigeons coming from coal temples and bridges that had great eye signs, but they lack all the rest. Here's another letter. Dennis, my high school helper, was in the hospital for 10 days, and he put additional work on me. I started to call you as I needed you badly and asked you if you would come and stay with me and as much as a week to help me with the birds while he has been in the hospital. In fact, my son helped feed and water the birds for several days. Sure sorry to hear you lost the hen from the red and imported Sions cock. I have her nestmate. Did you hatch the eggs given to you on August 10th? They're from my top Sions pair. We'll be selling about 200 of my old birds this spring. We'll start a big illustrated list. The Japanese fanciers want copies of this list sent to them by air mile a week in advance, so they have for one time select what they want. My colony will be drastically reduced to cut down on my work. I am now 76 years old and I want to be in Florida 2 or 3 times a year with our son and his lovely family. I love him so. This is just another reason why Miss Heitzman has asked me to do this. She frequently warns me that I work too hard for my age, and this is, of course, true. The lady loves me beyond words, and if you could see how she always preparing meals to suit me, you would have to admit she is 1 in a million with true love. There's another one. Letter. Remember the nice photo that you took in color of my friend's loft in Japan with the white fence? Could you make me a gloss print of that in black and white from the color negative? Let me know. I'll give you a great pair of young birds straight from High Pockets, and for doing all this. I hope you're doing very well. Here's another letter. I have started with my bands AU 73, KY 7211 instead of 7300 this year. I have banded 37 so far. Some of them are on order. Enclosing 69 lists, a 68 brochure. It goes on. Glad to hear that you're running for mayor of Ravenna. I can't believe it. But you would make a great mayor. Do I address you as the Honorable Earl Lowell Robbins Jr. from here on out, or what? I am having the lady to type the pedigree for you, a red-pied hen from the red imported Sions cock, the bird that I brought over from France. Here's another letter. I wrote a long letter to the two of you last month and wondered how you could buy a house and feed yourselves and the pigeons without being employed. Please pass on this great secret. Earl, I had to work hard in my first 3 years of married life. After we started the bakery, it began to showing high profits. In a short time, we were out of debt with a $27,000 building, a lot of money back in 1924, and growing establishment. Our 4 children were well educated, and I have all the others to mate by March 10th. When is your spring vacation? What dates? I would love for you to come and visit me during that time and stay for several days. I have a nice bedroom for you. As you know, it is yours. If you noted in my 1972 ad in the American Racing Pigeon News, there is no mention or welcome to visitors. It has been taking up too much of my time. This last summer, fanciers would barge in on me with their children, wife, and friends. I had to be on constant alert so they would not open the doors on my prisoner's loft and so many other matters. My wife said, "You are making a public park out of this place here." It was all okay until one day 4 young men with mustaches and beards knocked on the door. I was away at the bank. She told him to leave and come back in 1 hour. Exactly to the minute they returned. I spent 2 hours with them. I just cannot see who they are imitating with all that hair. It looked unsanitary and unkempt. My high school helper boy, the son of the barber, has long hair. Miss Heisman complains, but this lad does his work 100%, so I have to put up with it. He knows nothing of pigeons except that he gets $1.50 plus 10% an hour. I pay him 10.4% Social Security and a pension out of my own pocket, just plain work to him. Here's another letter referring to a treatise on the 500-mile daybirds. I teach him to fly late in the evening by tossing them at 8 p.m. just before dark. 2, I train them several days a week down the road, 20 to 30 miles. And 3, I rear one round from racers and then put dummy eggs under them. He goes on. He talks about the importance of, in my 32 years in Jeffersontown, we never once put any chemical fertilizers on the ground. It's important not to do that if your birds are out on open loft. Only limestone and lime in October every 3 years. Here is why: the chemical fertilizers contain harmful ingredients that can hurt a flock and make them sick even. You can beat the following natural bird habits. This open loft answers many times at 8 to 9 birds, which flew 504 miles on the day from an entry of 10 birds. Sorry, but at age 78 years old, I am not interested in the incubator hatching of eggs. There are too many other breeding and color experiments I want to work out. Nature promises that an egg will hatch in 18 days. I can tell from the egg and shell if it's a good, healthy hatch. In the sub-zero weather, an egg can easily get partially too cold or next to freezing. If we fool around in the loft too much during the time of the incubation, such chilled eggs never produce a champion. As F.W. Merritt once wrote, he was a real editor of the British Homing World. A champion pigeon must be perfect from the time you feed the hen before she lays the egg, a perfect diet, then no chilling of the egg, a clear breaking of the eggshell, a perfect feeding of the baby by both parents from the 1st to the 28th day. Only this cycle produces what all strive to breed for, in having a champion. One who can get a 504-mile year after year pigeon, maybe 10 times in 6 or 7 years of racing. I am watching the Sapporo Japan Olympics right now and writing in between to expect my handwriting not to be up to standard, a little more scribe. Here's another one. Yes, Robbie, I read your woodsider. The Mealy cock returned. He is safe from the Massarley's loft. I will be glad to see you when Art Selter's birds are delivered. I called Art the other day. He said that the large water reserve saved his house during the April tornado. A tree hit his loft and had to be repaired on one side. He lost 6 youngsters killed by the roof falling on the birds after the tree fell. I have known Art Selter since 1964. I am anxious to get a color-eye picture of 4 of my great birds with unique records. Got a letter from your friend Carl Dagrapon and told him that I could see him on Thursday or Friday. My parents were both in Germany. Dad's name Jacob, a good biblical name. My mother's name is Teresa, born in 1860. We had a very close-knit family. I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, also a 6th child which died 2 years of my age. My father lived to be 95 years old. Another letter. I never took a bird for eye sign. And you really can't even tell anything about eye sign until at least 6 weeks old. The eye of a racing pigeon changes from 4 weeks to 6 months of age. Again, my best racers have had the yellow circle. Not all had it complete. I refuse to answer your questions on how many birds I sell every year. That's like asking a man how much money does he make. And here's another letter. We attended Mass at 7 p.m. Saturday instead of going on Sunday. Regarding the Dorton catalog, it was sent to me and much enjoyed. Also, the Mazzarelli list. I send for them to add to the library. In many cases, $1 is enclosed, and I usually stipulate that the list for many of the library reference items. I have a list of all the greatest in England dating back to the 1920s and well before. Regarding the white pine seedlings that I put out, yes, I would appreciate those as gifts. I always love trees. I would give them great care if you bring them. I like the southern pines, but only a few are in our area. Do not bring me any more of that Miller's beer for a little while. I drink very little beer nowadays since being hospitalized. As for whiskey, we still have that fifth of Old Fitzgerald left from the golden anniversary. No one ever drinks the stuff, unless I get company who prefers it over beer. Yes, the $50,000 California win is quite a record. The only bird home on the second day. The mealy cock that you love is mated to a dark red hen with real dark eyes. She laid yesterday. The bird workman, a blue-white flight splash cock, sold in England for $9,200. Wow! Did you see the article by Tom Smith about the Sions, which appeared in the bulletin? He made an error by calling the Grizz Sions, meaning silver, grizzles. Several inquiries came to me about the Sions with the grizzle color. I told him that Tom had made a big mistake. I told that in all my years since 1920, I have never seen one single grizzle Sion. Grizz is a French name for the silver or mealy, as we in English call them, but certainly not speckled grizzles, as he referred to. Charlie. Dear No Sweat is another final letter I'll read to you. After you left my place Saturday, I went to my daughter's, and it was 2.5 hours later before I returned upon opening my mail. Mr. Roberts had sent me first-class mail, a copy of the 25th anniversary number of the Racing Pigeon Bulletin. To my great surprise, I came across the pictures you took and the article you wrote for his paper. Congratulations on a well-written article. Send me a fraternity band and I will band a baby for you as a gift for the splendid article you wrote about me. It is so much appreciated. I cannot tell you how much. Thank you so much. And here's another. I want to say this. I've been talking for just a little while, trying to give you all a real education about Charles Heitzman, because he was the best pigeon flyer that ever lived. Period. This story on Charles Heitzman has been a pleasure for me to bring to you, and I hope that you have enjoyed it. At some point in the future, I may write more about Charles Heitzman and his relationship, particularly with Mont Stassert. I have all the interesting and now historical and original correspondence. I also have the correspondence from many of these now historical legends or icons, which were instrumental in the formation of our current sport. In other words, when this sport came together, who made this sport? The George Washingtons of the sport. I could tell you about the day Heisman died, about the release of the pigeons over his grave. His is now resting beside his dear wife. I am not interested in doing all that. As some of you may remember, just a year ago, I went back to Charles Heitzman's estate in Jeffersontown, Kentucky. It was all I could do not to cry when I saw that everything was gone. I was compelled to write an article about the experience, which Sions published, and it was called Return to Nothing. I hope in some way I have managed to honor Charles Heitzman in this story, this discussion about him with you. We never know just how we touch anyone around us while we are living. Certainly Mr. Heitzman left his mark on me, as should be obvious. Last year, my loft partner and I had 8 day birds come home from 504 air miles. They were all young birds. And this year we had 6 return, again, young birds, all on the day. Only these young birds were basically untrained, late hatches, and were released in the dark clouds and headwinds. I value their worth even more than those that came home on the second day, this second group, on the day, the year before. And what even was more reasonable, they are all 504 mile young birds, solidly down from all of Charles Heitzman's finest old Paul Sion bloodlines. I know this would have placed a smile on Mr. Heitzman, knowing that his spirit continues to live on so close to where he once lived himself. For me, he will never die, and I will always maintain his Sions for as long as I live. I hope that you've liked this story. I will continue with another one that goes into the whole life of Paul Sion and Robert Sion, who they were, and why Charles Heitzman became attracted to them. There's really no other person that I know of alive today that knows the true story about Paul and Robert Sion, and I plan to also tell you that story. But for now, I'm ending this story about Charles Heitzman, and I hope I gave you some sort of picture as to who that man really was. Thank you.